Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is returning guest Ben Ryan, who is a very prolific author, writer, journalist, covering the gender conversation, specifically around gender pediatric care. And he's very focused on the data and on the research and on the law and the lawfare that's going on in this domain. And that's what the conversation covers, because there's always something new and interesting and controversial happening within Genderland. You can find links to Ben's work down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Ben Ryan.
All right, should we get going?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
I reached out to you to come back on the show, and you're like, happy to talk. There's always something going on in Genderland.
Yeah.
And gender's not my primary focus lately, but I like to keep my finger on the pulse, and you got your hand shoved up the artery.
We started?
Yeah, we're started.
Okay.
That's
All
the
right.
opening. Yeah.
All right.
So what's
So
been
you were
going
so
on?
calm, I wasn't sure if we were rolling.
Oh yeah, I keep the nervousness to a minimum.
Yeah.
Kind of stuff that way down inside my own arteries. But what has been going on in Genderland, so-called?
Well, I mean, the Trump administration has really put the entire transgender children medical field into a vice grip from so many different angles.
Oh,
So, I mean, for starters, the Supreme Court, of course, decided in June the Scrimeti case, which essentially gave deference to the states to decide for themselves whether to ban pediatric gender medicine, the prescribing of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and sometimes gender transition surgeries to minors. So that meant that at this point, 27 states that have banned it, those almost all of them go into effect. I think Montana might be an exception because the case there that had protested the ban went to the Montana Supreme Court, so the state Supreme Court, and apparently that Supreme Court, it violated their state constitution. So, but by and large, in about half the states in the nation, a little over half, have banned that. So, the Trump administration starts. And he starts rolling out all of his executive orders about everything under the sun. And one of them was denying federal funds to clinics and hospitals that provide gender transition services to people under age 19. And this was a bit of a switch from 18 to 19 as being the cutoff. And so there was some immediate reaction, like in New York State, New York City, a couple of the NYU Langone hospitals and others had at least put their systems on pause. And then you get Letitia James, the state AG in New York State, saying that's a violation of state anti-discrimination statutes. So they're certainly in a pickle. And there've been some lawsuits that have put that executive order on hold, but in the meantime, basically they're rolling out this entire all of government approach to attacking pediatric gender medicine. So, for example, the Trump administration, the Justice Department has submitted subpoenas to a myriad of hospitals around the country, and they're trying to get, medical records. And there's all these questions of, isn't that a violation of HIPAA? Well, of course, but there are exceptions to HIPAA where this is done. There are subpoenas for medical records. So that's not totally unheard of. And they're trying to go after these clinics, apparently saying that they have violated female genital mutilation statutes. And, it's hard to know exactly how they're finagling that statute to apply in this case, because the only way that it would obviously apply would be if you had, I suppose, if you had a phalloplasty, but which is never done among minors, in which you create this neopenis or whatever you want to call it. And I don't know if necessarily that would apply either to biological males getting a vaginoplasty, because that's not female gender mutilation. That would be, under at least their terms, male gender mutilation, the way that the Trump administration, everyone presumes, thinks about this. But I mean, in essence, the feeling is that whether any of this would hold up in court or not, they're just looking at every way to terrify these different clinics who provide these services in blue states. So, in addition, the FBI put out this, it was a tweet, I think it was in July, asking for informants for people who are violating whatever statutes. And you're wondering, like, well, what statute are you talking about? There have been cases, I mean, in Texas, I guess it's been about a year now that
Ethan Ham.
Ken Paxton went after one or two different medical providers who were, say, trying to get around the law banning puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones there by writing in a prescription where they were saying it was for an endocrine disorder not otherwise specified, which is a very common practice in this field. And this isn't necessarily what you call fraud, but there was this big conference, you could say, in Washington in July that the FTC put on, and when essentially they were speaker after speaker that they had were clearly laying the groundwork to try to justify the use of the FTC to go after medical providers for engaging in fraud, perhaps for, using these other types of diagnoses that, yeah, sorry, my ring light just fell down, that are not related to gender dysphoria specifically. One second. You can just edit this part out.
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Yeah. This thing is so
It
tenuous.
doesn't really make a difference because
It
you're
doesn't because
so well
there's a lot of good
lit.
natural light. I'll just turn it off.
Yeah.
Okay, so all this is to say that a barrage of legal avenues are being tried by the Trump administration, and indeed some of the major clinics in blue states, one after another, are starting to fold. The first major one was Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and that one is particularly notable because the pediatric gender clinic there is run by Joanna, or was run now by Joanna Olson Kennedy. So she's a major force in this field. And for those people who listen to The Protocol, the New York Times podcast that was put out in June about pediatric gender medicine, you'll recognize her as one of the two leading figures that were squaring off essentially over the debate over biopsychosocial assessments by a psychologist prior to receiving gender transition treatment. So, a kid comes in, having gender confusion or whatever, and they think they might want meds. In theory, if they're following the typical guidelines by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, they would receive some sort of assessment. So Olson Kennedy has long advocated against these assessments. She thinks that they're stigmatizing, that they don't do anything. Whereas you have Laura Edwards Leeper, she's a major psychologist, and she helped found this entire medical movement in the United States, importing it from the Netherlands to Boston Children's in 2007. She really is adamant for long psychosocial assessments. And in fact, it was last October, my reporting in New York Sun based on a court case, an employment court case over Boston Children's, based on a psychologist who formerly worked there and was fired. It came out that since 2018, it had been Boston Children's Hospital's policy, if a minor was seeking blockers or hormones, that they would receive only a single 2-hour assessment appointment from a psychologist before the clinic would decide whether they should be referred to endocrinology, possibly for puberty blockers. And they kept the secret for almost 7 years. So there's been a real tension in this field over the purpose and the mere existence of and the use of these assessments. So to see Olson Kennedy, who's been at the forefront of this, go have her entire clinic go down is really notable. And you've seen clinics, in Pittsburgh and in Boston. So we haven't seen like Seattle Children's nor Boston Children's has folded, but they're under so much pressure that essentially it appears that their boards and the people leading these big clinics are saying we can't sacrifice the fiscal health of the entire clinic system for this one clinic. And so they're sacrificing them. And, from the perspective of trans advocates, that's throwing them under the bus and, folding in advance of something. But what the leaders of Children's Hospital Los Angeles said internally was that we only have X amount of reserves financially. So even if we were in the middle of a court fight, it lasted for however period of time, during which we didn't have access to Medicaid funding, like it would destroy the entire hospital. So that's what they're facing. So the Trump administration has been extremely successful, and basically destroying this entire field, left and right, which, you've heard all of these stories in the last few years about families who, are very seriously believe in gender transition treatment and helping their children, fleeing states, red states for blue states. So it's quite tragic from their perspective, at least, that they might land in a state where then it turns out they can't get it there anyway, because that state has been sort of pummeled by the Trump administration. So I mean, it begs the question of what'll happen if let's just say there are 12 years of Democratic presidents, and starting in 2029, And does this all return? I don't know. So, but that's
Hmm.
where we are with this in the United States right now.
Well, one wonders if it will have the same or similar cultural force that put it into place. A lot of these
Right.
children's hospitals, it seems to me, jumped on the trans bandwagon because there was money there and you
You
could
could say
get more
that.
donations there. And now that it's a liability rather than a boon.
Yeah, I guess I never thought about that in terms of a kind of, if you could say it's kind of virtue signaling that increases their their appeal amongst donors. But if now it's creating an opposite effect, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, you'll see that, in 2016, the ACLU's fundraising went through the roof. So you see a lot of funding, I think, people donating in opposition as a kind of reactionary force to the Republicans. Although,
Hmm.
GLAAD, the formerly known as Gay and Lesbians Allied Against Defamation, their fundraising has actually gone down last year. We just saw their most recent 990. So their 2024 fundraising, I believe, went down, which was interesting because it was in the middle of the year. The New York Times came out with their big investigation about their profligate spending on behalf of their CEO. They'd helped pay for her vacation home and this lavish renovation of her home office and like a chandelier and that sort of thing. And she was flying first class to Davos and all of these glitzy places. So
Hmm. Hmm.
one wonders if toward the end of the year their fundraising really collapsed. But sometimes I've seen where I'm looking at 990 forums with AmFAR. I'd long been looking at it's an AIDS research nonprofit. And just the existence of a single donor going to one gala and having one big auction item can make or break an entire year. Suddenly there'll be another $15 million. And you're like, well, yeah,
Hmm.
that was because Harvey Weinstein, who was this big fundraiser for them, did X. So you never know. But
Interesting.
we'll see if that's a trend moving forward with GLAAD in
Yeah.
particular. So,
What was the downfall of Joanna Olson Kennedy's LA?
just the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles decided that it was not financially feasible to
Okay,
continue
it's
the
just
money
a
that they.
financial thing. There was no scandal
That,
beyond that.
well, yes, there was that, but they didn't mention that in, when they said that they were closing the clinic. But in December, Olson Kennedy, who I think she's about in her early 40s at this point. So she's really been a huge leader in this field, and
She's been on that Jazz Jennings show a lot. She was the
I
premier doctor, right?
presume. I don't know, but there are various famous interviews that she's given over the years, and one of them was an ABC, I think it was about 2016, in which she said, and this is now the basis of multiple lawsuits, these types of mantras, that
Hmm.
it would very commonly, if they're in the room with a parent and a child and the parent is reluctant to consenting to gender transition drugs for children, they'll say, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter, or vice versa? The implication being that if you don't give your kid these drugs, that the chance that they will commit suicide successfully is extremely high. So the suicide the suicidality and depression, anxiety is extremely common amongst youth who have gender dysphoria. However, the suicide death rate, while elevated, is still, it's still a rare outcome, according to at least one study that was done in England, another in Finland. It's really hard to do these studies because you have to have some sort of nationalized data because you can't
Yeah.
survey somebody who has died. So
Yeah.
in Finland last year, a big study came out in which they looked at all the suicide death data because they have nationalized data on just about everybody. And there's not really that much in or out migration in the population either. So they found that indeed that I can't remember compared to like age match controls, the suicide death rate was something like 3 to 5 times higher. But still a rare outcome, and that there was no statistically significant independent association between having gone on these drugs and having a difference in the suicide death rate.
Hmm.
And people sort of quibble like, well, if you were more forgiving about the p-value, which is essentially your cutoff about whether it's statistically significant, there would have been a difference. And I think my response to that is the reason why we're having this debate into that level of minutia is because these outcomes are so uncommon that you really can't hang the entire description of the efficacy of a drug on this outcome. I mean,
Yeah.
that it permits this claim that they're life-saving, but it's not an evidence-based claim and never has been. And
Yeah.
the head of WPATH told me that last year, Marcy Bowers, that this outcome has never been a good measure of the efficacy of these treatments. So,
Yeah. Any
but
more than school shooter outcomes.
In the sense,
Susa.
what do you mean?
If you would you rather have a depressed and weird son
Uh-huh.
or a trans shooting daughter, right?
I
Because
don't
the
think it's
school shooting things. I know. I'm just saying
I
it's
wouldn't use that as
statistically
a reference. What I'm saying
insignificant,
is like
right?
depression, anxiety, would be a better measure. They're
Yeah.
easier to measure for one thing. They're more common, so therefore you can get a statistically
And the
significant
overlap
result.
with
You
mental
know,
illness and gender dysphoria is really
yeah,
high to begin with.
yeah. So there are all
There's
these
always,
debates about chicken or egg debates.
yeah.
Are these myriad psychiatric diagnoses amongst this population with gender dysphoria? Are they an outgrowth of the same thing that leads to the gender dysphoria, or is the gender dysphoria, leading to those other things? Of course, it's never going to be unidirectional, but a
Hmm.
lot of questions about that and whether gender dysphoria is itself and more so trans identification is a maladaptive coping mechanism based on
Hmm.
children who have myriad other anxieties, etc.
Yeah, and it could have to do also with social acceptance of gender nonconformity, and
Yeah.
that's peer
Yes. Minority
pressure.
stress theory is the
Yeah.
basic idea. So it's
What's your take on minority stress theory? It's
I
many
mean, my
run of the
general,
lawn, and
it's something that Elon Meyer at the UCLA's Williams Institute founded that concept in the early 2000s, really about sexual orientation, and it's been broadened to encompass gender identity. But I think it's one of those things that maybe hasn't been studied well enough in the latter category. But having written about HIV science forever, and that's always coming up, and I
Mhm.
have developed a great deal of cynicism just in that context because you'll hear these things, oh, these HIV is so much higher in gay men, and it's all because of minority stress, and you're like, I'm sorry, but gay men's propensity for going out and hooking up all the time, you can argue, I think, successfully that perhaps growing up in a stigmatized environment and which leads you to have all these internalized distress, which then you tend to coping mechanisms through alcohol and drugs and partying, and that leads you to HIV. That makes sense, but to rationalize all of HIV acquisition that way just really denies the fact that in any culture in which there are only men, you're going to lack the moderating impulses of women. So you can
Mhm.
find that fraternities, whatever it might be, like men tend to be somewhat heedless. So if it's
Mhm.
only men and it's all about sex, they're going to have a lot of it. So
Mhm.
that sort of logic is lost, I think. It's very un-PC, to use, I guess, the older term
Yeah.
that we used to use in the olden days, to sort of blame the victim and like, well, if these guys wouldn't go out and party so much, they wouldn't have gotten these viruses. You
Yeah.
could never stand up and say that in in an HIV conference. You'd just be like run
Even
out of the
today, do
building.
you think that there's been a
Oh God, no. Like you look at that
really?
with monkeypox, like nobody wanted to admit it, that it was just like, I mean, just there was this clip going around of Dimitri Daskalakis. So he came out of New York City's health department. He was like the HIV czar, and he went over to CDC and did HIV and monkeypox work. And ultimately, he just resigned from the CDC 2 weeks ago in protest over everything that's happening with RFK
Vaccines and
Jr.
stuff.
So he
Yeah.
was the head of their vaccine department essentially. And there was this clip going around of him saying it like, during the monkeypox era, like, I've never diagnosed a case of HIV that wasn't based in stigma. And I'm wondering, like, well, how do you even know that? Like, that's, like,
Mm.
you're not sitting there giving this person 20 hours of psychotherapy. But,
Yeah.
I had this viral tweet based on that clip where I was saying, I'm sorry, but I interviewed a lot of the first cases of monkeypox, and it was largely, white, wealthy guys who like to go around and party, and they'd go from, party to party in West Hollywood to, somewhere in Miami and New York, and next thing you know, you've seen an entire global outbreak,
Oh.
and that propensity just toward hedonism, uh,
Yeah.
it's a little hard to sort of over intellectualize it into some sort of reaction to some sort of misery. You're like, no, these guys are not having fun. So, I mean, I can look at it both ways, but I
Hmm.
just tend to be more cynical. So,
Yeah.
about that. In terms of gender identity, I think I don't know as much about like how it's been applied, but I do have the sense that it hasn't been researched very thoroughly. But it's again, it's hard to realize that these things aren't necessarily unidirectional.
Hmm.
And there's even a study that's showing it was that I think trans and non-binary people tend to be more aggressive. And the case of Nex Benedict, who last year was in that fight in the bathroom in the Oklahoma public school, and then killed themselves later that day with an overdose of antihistamines, of Benadryl. And, if you look at the video of Nex describing in the ER to a cop what happened, the Nex essentially the Nex was the aggressor. He's like, you guys got a problem with us, kind of thing, and uh, and next thing you know, there's this big fight. So, but
Hmm.
it's very inconvenient. All of these narratives that get established whenever we have like these big tragedies that are on video.
Hmm.
Like say, Michael Brown. It was always the story of like nice young fellow like getting some candy and going home to grandma's house. And then you find out that he was charging the cop when he got shot. This
Yeah.
is not to say at all that anybody deserves to be shot, but once the initial narrative that was right out of some sort of, folk tale was established, I was really fascinated by how impossible it was to pry that from people's minds. Because,
Hmm.
it's once you have a very Manichaean story, the sort of black and white thinking is set up, whether literally or figuratively, more metaphorically black or white,
Yeah.
um, people really don't want to let go of it because I think it entrenches a sense of safety from danger in people if
Yeah.
they can define good and evil and without sort of the blurred lines,
Yeah.
Anakin
Well,
Skywalker getting pulled over to the dark side kind of thing.
yeah, right. Yeah, lightsabers don't kill people. Anakin
Yeah.
does. Or children, I should say.
Mm.
One narrative that has been profoundly effective, specifically with the establishment of pediatric gender medicine, is the concept of the trans kid. I know
Right.
you do research mostly in the hard science, the data, the
Yeah.
FOIA, but there is that folktale of the trans child. I'm wondering if you can gather in your reading and
Mm.
writing in the topic in general, if that narrative is warping, changing, becoming less powerful.
I couldn't say necessarily it's changing, but I mean, the way that I have to write about it, I don't tend to use the term trans child in my writing because the identity is such a matter of dispute. Therefore, it's not my position to define somebody that way when in so many cases, whatever I'm writing about is the question of I was talking about this over the weekend with somebody. Like, even if you don't believe there is such a thing as trans identity, let's just say that that's a proxy for a permanent state of gender dysphoria and internal conflict over the conflict between your body and your mind when it comes to gender
Hmm.
and sex. So, one way of looking at what does it mean to be a trans child from the position of somebody, let's say, who is conducting a psychosocial assessment of somebody who's coming in with gender-related distress is do we think this person is going to suffer from gender dysphoria indefinitely
Mm.
and throughout their entire life absent some sort of modification? And I think one of the things that bothers me about how the intellectual groundwork and the political groundwork was laid out for the entire pediatric gender medicine project is, even in adults, and this is something that, in the mid 20th century people got used to with Renee Richards, the idea of a sex change or whatever you want to call it is a very radical intervention. Just as plastic surgery in general can be very radical. I mean, you look at the Kardashians. Like, somebody
Hmm.
once said like their whatever they were born into was just a light suggestion, like a starter face. You know,
Yeah.
so
Huh.
you know if people had sort of come in and said like, listen, we're going to start off, and we acknowledge that the idea of rerouting a child's entire endocrine system into the opposite sex is extremely radical, and even providing them, extreme body modification surgery, such as removing their breasts when they're as young as 12 years old. However, here's why we believe this is represents a good balance of risk versus benefits.
Yeah.
So, you know, who am I'm not kidding myself to think that like, all the Republicans would say, oh, now that you put it that way, that is reasonable. Like, but, I think there are, say, normie centrists, center leftists who might be more receptive to that, where as opposed to what it has been, which is around 2018, Jesse Singal writes about this from the Atlantic for the first time. People start to say, "Oh, what's all this? What are they doing with children?" And then as people start to have some misgivings about it, it becomes more and more common. And parents hear about it. There's some other kid in the class or it's their child, and all of a sudden it starts to become very salient in everyday contemporary life. And then
Hmm.
some people are uncomfortable with that. The immediate reaction from the major activists and advocates in this space is, "How dare you question this? You're a bigot." this is settled science. And that's a quote from GLAAD 2023. They ran a truck. Well, it was either parked or run around the New York Times building. I never know for sure. But it said on the side, if the New York Times, how dare you report about this in this hateful way? I'm paraphrasing that, but it said the science is settled, quote,
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
pediatric gender medicine, which is false about everything. Even gravity, we had sort of wrong apparently. I mean, I don't know, but
Yeah, right.
just
Yeah, yeah.
that's saying such a thing just betrays such a profound ignorance about what the scientific process is in general, but in particular about this field. Like, no, it's not settled. And here's how we know. Here are all these systematic literature reviews that show the evidence is weak. And what does that mean exactly? And so on. So to get back to your initial question, like what is the meaning of the trans child? We're getting that's such a philosophical question, but what I can tell you is those philosophical questions are answered by places like the American Academy of Pediatrics. So in 2018, they put out a policy statement, as it's called. It's not a medical guideline, it's a policy statement, but
Yeah.
it's on the border of being a medical guideline. It sort of tees up the Endocrine Society or WPATH treatment guidelines. And one of the key things it said is that children, even very young children, know who they are, transgender children just as well as cisgender children. So
Hmm.
that's a very profound statement. Was it backed up by solid research? No. But that is at the core of the argument. And I think that a lot of that argument, the man who wrote that policy statement, Dr. Jason Rafferty, who at the time was still only a medical resident, and he was the sole author of this piece. It was edited, with a small committee, but on the actual PDF, it says he's solely responsible for it.
Hmm.
He's a gay man, at the time was I guess in his 30s. And I think that the conception for a lot of people, a lot of the thought leaders in this field are gay adults of middle age or so, and we know as a society that society made a big mistake with the gays in the 20th century, and everything that happened with conversion therapy, and gays were given shock treatment and put in emetics and put in psych hospitals for long periods of time and so on. And you cannot change sexuality. Like, we know this for a fact. They tried, they pummeled these poor people. These people have traumatized forever, etc. So we're going to apply that lesson now that we have a second chance.
Hmm.
It kind of reminds me of the end of Vertigo when he says, "Judy, this is my second chance." Due to the reference, it doesn't turn out well. It's a very Greek tragedy. That movie scared the bejesus out of me. My parents showed me that movie when I was 10 years old. Like, I
Oh,
couldn't barely
wow.
sleep.
10. Okay.
Well,
Wow.
we're going to San Francisco, so let's show you Vertigo. Uh, they didn't like my mother like encouraged me to watch Twin Peaks when I was 11.
Okay.
Like, it was
All
art,
right.
anyway.
Yeah.
What was I saying? So we have a second chance with trans children to do it right. They know themselves just like gays. Do they? We don't know. But the problem is, it's hard to study this, but there have been two studies that that look at like diagnosis data in Germany, and I forget where the other one was based. I guess it's based on U.S. data. First one was a published study, and the other one was an analysis done by Lior Sapir at the Manhattan Institute. But if they look at the persistence of gender dysphoria or gender dysphoria-like diagnoses in medical charts over time, the majority of those diagnoses will disappear after a few years. So it's hard to know exactly what that means, but it certainly means that somebody had cause to put in the first place. And then, you would tend to re-enter it if you had cause to use it for insurance coverage.
Hmm.
So it suggests that at least for things that would require insurance coverage, and that could be mental health therapy, or it could be puberty blockers, that those diagnoses tend to dissipate. So, you know, we don't know the ultimate detransition rate, and people love to throw out numbers. And if you ever hear somebody who throws out a number with confidence, you know that they don't know the data or they're being deliberately deceptive.
Hmm.
Because the reality is we don't know, and you'll get figures like, oh, it was less than 1%, and then you're like, yeah, but that was a study about adults about surgery and it had a high loss to follow up. Therefore, that is highly unreliable in and of itself, but it actually doesn't apply to 12-year-old children. So, and especially because we've seen so much change in the last, or at least since about 2011, 2012, which coincided with the advent of social media on phones, by the way, of
Hmm.
this enormous upswing in trans identification and gender dysphoria diagnoses in children. Hundreds of thousands of diagnoses of gender dysphoria, maybe something to the order of 15,000. I would say a high figure of 20,000 children have probably received some form of you get puberty blockers, hormones, and or surgery.
Wow,
It's
that's big
really hard.
business.
It's really hard to know. Something to the effect of privately insured minors. Recent study came out, I guess was early this year or last year, found that by the age of 17, about 1 in 1,000 minors are on cross-sex hormones. And people are like, is that a little? That's a lot. That's a matter of opinion, in my opinion. I think maybe you could argue it both ways, but
Hmm.
that number is it was over a 2018 to 2023 period that that study was done. So during that period, we know that these types of treatments were on the upswing. So by the end of that period, which is right before all the bans are really starting to go into place, that figure was probably higher, and it was certainly higher in natal girls. So we've had this upswing in trans identification and gender dysphoria diagnoses in young people, but the cohort, their phenotype, if you will, has been very different the way it has been historically. Historically, it was like a very, very small number of natal boys, from a very young age, who
Hmm.
express this very strong cross-sex identity. The majority of those kids tended up to grow up to be gay men in the end. But then we get this surge of natal girls getting gender dysphoria after the onset of puberty. And so the
Hmm.
question is, not enough time has really passed for us to know the trajectory of these young people. And they're often just sort of folded in with everybody else. The researchers don't tend to distinguish between essentially different entry points of these type of identities and this type of mental distress, which is a
Mm.
shame because it's
Yeah.
very likely that,
What are they even researching if they're not researching that?
oh, I guess that's a broad question, but
Well, yeah, it kind of it's rhetorical, but
it's very common, and then I've seen this in the HIV world as well. For example, no
hmm.
one has ever, and this is a very simple figure you could do, established a rate ratio of comparing the HIV diagnosis or transmission incidence between gay men and straight women and straight men. And no one has ever bothered to publish this. And you wonder why, because like you think you'd want to know. They compare these other figures all the time. And in my opinion, it's because nobody wants that figure running around because it makes gay men look bad. And I asked somebody at Emory to do it for me, and it was about 200 to 400 fold difference in HIV acquisition rates between gay men and straight women and straight men, respectively. So
Okay.
there are a lot of questions, a lot of sort of like outcomes in studies that are just not asked or
Yeah.
not reported
Well,
in the first place.
in the HIV world, it's what is the rationale and beyond political correctness for
Hmm.
not challenging gay male hedonism rather than
Yeah, I
just
mean, well, I
popping
think,
pills? Like, why
yeah,
not
right.
confront their behavior and say that
Yeah.
there's this thing called consequences?
Yeah. I mean, one is I think that various ways attempts at provoking behavior modification really were not very successful. So I think
Okay.
that those were tried in the 80s and 90s. And part of the problem, though, is that it's actually also very hard to study. It's very messy, behaviors. You're going to have to rely on self-reported behavior for one thing, like did you wear a condom? That, people self-report, especially about things that are stigmatized, tends to be very unreliable. So
Yeah.
when you get like the HIV prevention pill comes along, that's something with very clear outcomes. And you can also study whether you can assess whether they're taking it because you can look at their drug levels in the body with blood samples.
Hmm.
So, the HIV world loved that, because you could prove it. Whereas even with condoms, very hard to prove that they work. Obviously, they do, but proving that is extremely difficult because you can't objectively measure whether or not somebody wore one.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
yeah.
So changing behavior is beyond the scope,
Oh,
or there's
yeah,
just
but
no
yes,
evidence
behavior.
based.
There's that, and it's not very effective. But also, I think that HIV activists are so intense that in the height of the ACT UP era, that it was made so clear that you were sort of not to boss us around, and that was very unpolitically correct. And I think that that's just permanently entrenched in that field. And then you saw
Yeah.
that really come to a head with monkeypox because here was this extreme sudden emergency and
Right
major
after
health
Pride
leaders.
Month.
Yeah, well, Pride Month certainly. And I'd written about this leading up to Pride Month, like this is your moment to try to prevent it. Like, oh, guess that didn't work
Oh,
out. And on the
yeah.
contrary, and
Whatever happened to monkeypox? Did that just
well, it burned out. Essentially, it is my opinion. I don't. And this is another thing that people don't want to put down on and pen and ink because they think it'll discourage people from getting vaccinated. But monkeypox had an incubation period of about like 2 to 10 days. I think the median was about 7 days. And there was, a short period before noticeable symptoms when there was at least either asymptomatic transmission or at least transmission before you realized that that little thing, on in your groin was not just a pimple, let's just say. So that meant that so long as there were men who could maintain transmission chains because they had new partners very frequently, within a few days, once the virus ran through that population of men who do engage in routine or concurrent sexual partners routinely, uh, new sexual partners routinely, um, very quickly, in a matter of weeks. So you saw it really entered the United States around the end of May, and it peaked around the first week of August. And that was really before the mass rollout of vaccines. And what had happened was the virus just started hitting dead ends with people who didn't have a new sexual partner within 2 weeks. And then, oops, I have monkeypox. So then you're going to take yourself out of the game. Not only necessarily because you have beneficent aims of not giving someone a horrible infection, but you look disgusting. Nobody's going
Oh,
to
there's
want to
an
have sex with somebody.
aesthetic component to
Yeah,
it.
so
Huh.
you didn't have to rely on them just being nice guys. Like they're out of the game until that all these lesions go away. And also some of them were in like complete agony. So like the last thing they want to do is have sex because their
Okay.
rectum is full of lesions and it's terrible. So
Wow.
once all of the core transmitter group, it's called, like let's say 15% of gay guys who have a lot of new sex all the time, new partners, then there was essentially nowhere else for it to go. But
Okay.
what that means is that, yeah, there was a lot of vaccination, but as time passes, the overlap between vaccination and natural immunity and current behavior patterns will start to separate.
Hmm.
Both just because of changing behavior patterns going out of relationships, but also because of younger guys coming of age who are not vaccinated. So once enough time has passed, almost without a doubt, you'll at least see smaller outbreaks of monkeypox, which is very
Okay.
concerning, especially because we're seeing like a different subtype in Africa that's been transmitting that's much more fatal? Is it because it's all in like immunocompromised children with poor nutrition? We don't know, but it's
Yeah.
concerning that that could be have a much greater morbidity and mortality in the United
Mm.
States.
Yeah.
Sometime down the line, we'll see.
I'm sure nobody would admit to doing this, but the gay male that pool of participants could
Hmm.
be used to study transmissible viruses if one were so inclined.
Well, sure. I mean, I
And
think a
it
lot of
probably
people
gives
make
you
their
really
careers out
good
of this.
data.
It
Yeah,
does.
no, okay, yeah. So yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, there are entire career paths that do nothing but study gay men. And, like, why did you get up in the morning and decide you cared about gay men? It was like, well, partly it's just like a fertile ground for research. And also, gay men are often very open about just discussing whatever their sexual
Oh, okay.
proclivities.
Yeah, so you
There
can
was this
get a lot of
moment
data.
where I was at this HIV conference in, I think, 2018, and there was a poster presentation, and it was a very rare case of somebody having acquired HIV while on the HIV prevention pill PrEP, and they were taking it routinely. So they were doing that was all taken care of. And in the few times we have these kind of breakthrough infections, it's because the virus itself that they acquired was resistant to one or both of the drugs in the HIV prevention pill. But this
Okay.
was the only case anyone had ever found in which that was not the case. They had still acquired it. And it was this guy who was in this long-running study where they were like taking a diary every day of all their sexual behaviors in the Netherlands. And this guy was like going for a world record. Like he had something like it was like over 100 partners a month, and there were some days where you'd have like 7 to 10 or something. And and you're around all these sort of like very, they're in, they research sex and some crazy stuff, but they're researchers. They're zipped up types,
Yeah.
and they're really down with like non-stigmatizing lingo, and
Yes.
they're looking at these numbers and they're going, my goodness. I wonder how he managed to still contract the virus. Is it possible there was so much semen in his rectum that it formed a deposit that over time somehow buffered against the presence of, the drug, and then created this localized infection that ultimately broke through? It was so funny to watch them. kind of imagining this guy's life and then remembering like, don't say any sex negative stuff,
Yes.
at the same
Yeah.
time they're thinking like, oh my God, this guy is a total,
Yeah.
oh, there is a
Wow.
cat.
Yeah,
You have a
I got
kitten.
my kid. Yeah.
Yeah, mine are six
He's the
months
new guy.
old. You must be like,
Oh, yeah.
what, he's about two
He's
months
about
old?
4 or 5 months
Really?
old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's growing pretty
Mine
fast.
are sleeping.
Oh, cute.
So, so
The
yeah.
on the so there's this guy Gordon Guyatt. He
Yeah, we'll get to
formulated
that.
this evidence-based gender medicine. It's called GRADE. Big
So
long word.
not leave out the gender medicine. He
Oh
was
yeah,
one of the
no.
co-founders of the
Of
evidence-based medicine field. It has nothing to do specifically with gender medicine.
Yeah, evidence-based. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Evidence-based, and he's got this grade thing: recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation.
Yeah.
And
So
he
grade
developed.
is a system of analyzing the strengths of scientific research, essentially, and just
And
trying
as a
it's trying
tool to
yeah.
help people to decide on treatment, whether
Yeah,
to
to
basically do a cost
establish,
benefit analysis.
stronger, more evidence-based guidelines and ultimately to improve clinical decision making. So
Yeah.
grade is a way of trying to strip out human bias, essentially,
Hmm.
the best you can. You never do it perfectly.
Yeah.
When you're assessing the quality of, it could be anything, should we put a stent into somebody's heart when X happens?
Yeah.
Should you prescribe this statin over that when this happens? So,
Yeah, so there's very fine grades of how this is useful to
mm,
make these decisions, and then there's the
mm.
bigger like mortality rates on using different medications for
Yeah, it could be
certain.
anything, any
Yeah, it could
number
be
of
anything.
outcomes they're considering.
When applied to gender medicine, though, it gets kind of squishy because gender medicine, specifically pediatric gender medicine, is so deeply based on subjective reporting. There's no.
Totally. But that's true also for, almost all of psychology as well, or
Yeah,
psychiatry. So you have to
psychology.
acknowledge but it's, you'll have these validated scales of depression and they've been analyzed. So if you use this form, it's fairly predictive of somebody having depression. So,
Hmm.
that's kind of ways that they try to systematize the subjective nature of these kind of
Mm,
self-reports. I mean, I remember first I went on depression and depressed. I was 14 years old and
okay.
I had been told about them as 1982, and this sounded great to me. I'd been very sad, so I knew what I was doing when I filled out that form. I fudged it, not too much.
Oh yeah,
You don't want to get put in an insane asylum, but I fudged the numbers a little bit to make sure I got what I wanted. So in any
yeah. So
case,
these things are like inherently open to bias or
yeah,
manipulation
yeah,
because
you
if
know,
somebody wants something, they're going to figure out, especially if they're
yeah.
smart enough to figure out these
And there are all
different
sorts
forms.
of, Reddit forums or wherever in which kids are given instructions on what to say to doctors if they want puberty blockers. So it's
Yeah,
not too hard to do. But yeah, so to your point is the field of evidence-based medicine, which is, essentially trying to get around what's called GOBSAT or good old boy sitting around the table, in which in the olden
mm,
days, just like the old doctors would be like, do you guys tend to prescribe, an aspirin a day for heart attacks? And that wouldn't have been back then, but whatever, what may have been,
yeah,
what do you do? Oh, okay, we'll put together some guidelines. And I'm of course exaggerating, making it seem a lot less systematic than it really is. But, you know, that type of discussion where like what do you see in your patients is the
yeah,
lowest form of evidence-based medicine. There's a pyramid, a hierarchy of strength of evidence, and on the bottom is clinical opinion, and the top are meta-analyses is systematic reviews, sort of in the middle of the randomized controlled trials, and there's below that is observational trials, et cetera. So
hmm,
this field starting in the late 2010s, various systematic reviews have been conducted about the evidence backing prescribing puberty blockers and hormones to cross-sex hormones to minors. And all of the evidence either low or very low. So what those terms mean specifically, there's very low, low, moderate, and high. So high means that you can be quite confident that if you're following whatever clinical practices, that the outcomes that you see in the study will be reflective of real world practice. If
hmm,
I prescribe this chemotherapy to this person, they have a very good chance of surviving and having a 5-year survival rate of X. Whereas very low means you essentially have no idea whether these outcomes of these studies are reflective of real world practice. And low
hmm,
is, a little bit better and so on up. And so what those terms mean is that for all these studies, you constantly hear, oh, this is improving all of these mental health outcomes and suicide, that that's not based in studies that can guarantee that, in fact, those outcomes are what they say they will be. But that's true for a lot of medicine. It's true for a lot of pediatrics. But it's a lot more complicated than either, say, the right or the left makes out. Where the right says, "Oh, we should ban it because these are low quality evidence," and the left saying, "You're not understanding that low quality evidence is actually very common in pediatrics in particular." And so
Mm,
you have to look at it from the angle of, say, if they're what's the alternative for one thing? So if you have, let's say you've got a fatal, desperately fatal cancer and you're going to die in a week, you might as well just try this other drug. It's it's okay to have very low quality evidence there and have like even a strong recommendation for it because you have nothing else to lose and there is no other alternative. Whereas say for like there's prescribing my children aspirin versus Tylenol when they have a fever because aspirin, all parents hopefully know, can cause Ray's syndrome. Actually the evidence showing that Tylenol is the evidence backing that that's going to happen is actually very weak. But because Tylenol is effective and safe, the alternative means that we don't really care if the evidence is weak. So
hmm
there are all these different ways where you have to add, one or two other variables to assess the implications of having low quality evidence. In the case
mm,
of pediatric gender medicine, essentially people who are skeptics of it will say, well, it's low quality evidence. And while that may be true for a lot of treatments, this is unique in the sense of the potential harms are extraordinary and extreme. And in particular, infertility. And there's a lot of debate, I think, over whether it will lead to sexual dysfunction. But those are so extreme that the HHS report that came out earlier this year, the Trump administration quite controversially commissioned this report, which came out, it was, hundreds of pages long in May. And people sort of just cast it aside because it was a prescribed outcome. I mean, they picked people to write it who they presumed would come up with very skeptical answers. But their argument was that these outcomes are so extreme that it's not even ethical to study this in clinical trials, which is the way it's being done, say, in Scandinavia right now.
yeah.
So you
So
have to take
the
that into
outcome
consideration.
of pediatric gender medicine is, well, just let's say that
Mm.
the puberty blockers, it hasn't been thoroughly studied the effect that puberty
I mean,
blockers have.
I would put
They're
it more, it
still
hasn't been studied
exploring.
in
Okay.
very well designed studies.
Okay.
Thoroughly, I think is subjective, but there have been quite a few studies, but they haven't had a lot of long-term follow-up. A lot of them have had a lot of loss to follow-up, and they haven't had comparison groups in a lot of the cases where the comparison group was, had huge loss to follow-up, things like that.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult, both ethically and practically, to design a randomized controlled trial, but Gordon Guyatt, who we'll certainly talk about in greater detail in a second, at this conference put on by the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, or SEGM, in New York 2 years ago that I attended. Um, he argued, there you could have a delay trial where you have everyone on a waiting list, and then you just randomize people to be delayed by, say, a year of whether
Hmm.
when they get the drugs. So, and then you compare that 12-month period. The problem about that design is that, and this is something that came up in that conference, is that if a kid wants anything badly enough, it could be candy, it could be medication. Once they get it, there's an initial rush. It's Christmas Day.
Mm.
So that isn't necessarily going to be reflective of their entire life on
Yeah.
testosterone or whatever it might be. So, and
Yeah.
there was a study in Australia that did randomize young people, but it was only a 3-month delay. And the problem with that study is it was for testosterone in particular, is that testosterone, irrespective of the physical changes that it's supposed to cause, which take a little while to set in, causes an initial feeling of euphoria.
Yeah.
So if you're going to report that you feel great on it, that's an off-target effect of the purpose of the drug.
Yeah.
So and then everyone else is possibly just feeling bad because they haven't yet got what they wanted. And that
Yes.
isn't necessarily an effect that is specific to testosterone. That is an effect of being made to wait for anything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it doesn't really measure on either end of this the actual desired impact of the drug, which is facial hair and larger muscularity and that kind of thing, and lower voice, etc.
Yeah.
Those effects, how do we feel about that? The study wasn't even run long enough to actually measure those happening.
Yeah.
So Gordon Guyatt, is this big titan in this field. He's now about 72 years old. his lab, he didn't really run these studies, but it was under his lab, under his name, was contracted by SEGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, in 2021 to conduct 5 systematic literature reviews about blockers, hormones, what's
Yeah.
called binding and tucking of the penis, binding of the breast, social transition, and mastectomies. So the three of those came out. The surgery one and the blockers and hormones earlier this year. No surprise, low quality evidence. We don't really know. Have great confidence about what these outcomes really portend, etc. And so that really gets going a big activist pushback. And it also come out
Why
to
would
the
the
end
activists push back against?
because they know that these kinds of studies, which have been published for many of them over the years since the late 2010s, have been leveraged to back bans or big pullbacks in the use of these treatments, say in England. So even though by that point the Scrimeti case over the Tennessee's ban of pediatric gender medicine had already had oral arguments in December. So the Supreme Court wasn't going to hear any more amicus briefs about that. They'd all been submitted in the fall or the summer the previous year. And then that case was decided in June, as we talked about earlier. There were still, ways that this was sort of working its way, say, in the legal system. Clarence Thomas referenced one of the Gaia team's papers in his concurring opinion. It wasn't the majority decision, mind you. It came up repeatedly in the HHS report they referred to. So this really irked the advocates. They're saying that this is being leveraged for bans, and ultimately SEGM's main goal is to use these systematic reviews to create treatment guidelines to work in opposition to WPATH, which kind of rule the roost in the US. So
Mhm.
activists started pushing back in that. And also the Southern Poverty Law Center in December of 2024 put out this very messy report they call the Captain Report. And it took me like hours to read this thing. And it was riddled with typos. And in essence, it was called like sort of like the pseudoscience of all these anti-LGBTQ hate groups. And it was using a lot of sort of guilt by association to try to create at least an innuendo effect that like SAGM and other groups were hate groups. And ultimately, SAGM was designated a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2024. But the rationalization for this was frankly so weak, but people take very seriously what SPLC says. And one of their ways of saying that Sagan was bad was they were saying, well, there are these big funds and they take in money from like the bad people from like conservatives, and then they give out money also to some like bad groups, some, like conservative, anti-LGBT groups, etc. But the problem is that so what they were really pointing at what are called donor advisory funds. And anybody who's got a little bit of money and tends to give to charity will know that anybody can get one of these. It's just like having your own mini foundation. So like if you've got some money with Charles Schwab, you just put it in your donor advisory fund account and then you can give out money from there. It's a way of sort of organizing your taxes essentially.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's all this was like just big banks taking money, from point A to point B and giving it to point C. But never the twain shall meet. It did meet, in the actual bank that was just like a go-between. And
Okay.
who else gets millions of dollars from these same funds is the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was totally meaningless and moot. But people take this very seriously. So an activist campaign pressured Guyette's group. There's this little Instagram account that was pressuring them and tying them with segments saying they're white supremacist hate group, associated, etc.
Hmm.
And then there were internal pressure. People at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, either parents of trans kids or trans people working in the trans clinic started pressuring them. And there was pressure through like their version of DEI department, et cetera. So ultimately they caved, and the McMaster group on August 14th put out this big statement in which they denounced the use of their systematic reviews for 2 back bans of pediatric gender medicine. And
Well,
they
hold on
go
one
ahead.
second.
Hmm.
So, this is thoroughly politicized, but
Yes.
how, on what grounds can you stop evidence? Isn't the express purpose of Guyette's foundation or what he runs grade
Yeah.
to just collect evidence.
Yeah, like they shouldn't be telling everyone how to use the data. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not unprecedented for him to say how people should interpret his work. There, he did a systematic review about red meat and processed meats association with cardiovascular disease, and essentially found low evidence. So he just came out and said, like, if you want to eat all this stuff, go ahead, you're fine. That's really not very strong evidence saying this is going to give you a heart attack. So that
Okay.
caused a lot of kerfuffle. But I don't think that eating red meat, as much of a hot topic as that obviously is for many, many people, it reminds me of when Mike Pence, in one of his campaign speeches in 2020, he said, Kamala Harris wants to take away Americans' meat. So it's very red meat in American. So, in any case, it's Canada, mind you, but
Yeah.
it's not nowhere near as politicized as pediatric gender medicine. So,
Okay.
I think that other people have
But what do
spoken
we
of it.
do with the evidence? All of the
Yeah,
activists, and
yeah.
assumably some of them
They
do
want to
care
dismiss it
about
as
truth.
pseudoscience because it's associated with Segum. Segum, you know,
Okay.
Segum funded these systematic reviews. Therefore, it's tainted,
Okay.
in the minds of
But
the
there's nothing
activists.
beyond that. There's the systematic reviews are
Yeah,
solid, and they fulfill the purpose of research, which is to
right.
gather and
They're assessing
articulate data.
research.
Yeah.
It's a meta-scientific endeavor, essentially.
Yeah. So,
Um,
and did
so
these any given one of these studies point toward any sort of solid evidence for pediatric gender medicine on
solid
any
in
of
the
those
sense
levels
of
that
nothing
you?
stronger than low quality evidence. So no.
Okay.
Which isn't to say people, and so there are all these arguments about, well, what do you do with that? And in the conference that Guy and others from his lab went to, that Sagan put on 2 years ago, there were very robust debates about patient autonomy and what's called patient values and preferences. So
Yes.
he's really argued very strongly for patient autonomy in a climate of low quality evidence that if you don't know what you're doing, you're sort of like, well, what do you want to do? Um, I guess a lot of people I've talked to are saying like, well, this is a really weird context in which to say that. It's, a better way of looking at it saying like, if there were low quality evidence for somebody who's got terminal cancer and like maybe has, let's say, 10 months to live, but if we gave him this chemotherapy, which you haven't studied very well and there's low quality evidence about it, he might live another 6 months. But
Yeah.
he'd also be a lot sicker during that period of time. But then his daughter's graduation is during that period. So his values and preferences, I value being sicker yet living longer, and I'm going to take on the risks that that might cause, like having a stroke or something, or the
Yeah.
fact, so that's a more clear-cut example, I think. But as I said earlier, so many of the different experts that I talked to, ethicists, are saying, Gordon Guy is really moving out of his lane and failing to acknowledge that there are four major pillars of evidence-based medicine, one of which is patient autonomy, the other is beneficence, so helping your patients, non-maleficence, not harming your patients, and justice, which is more complicated. And
Mm.
so, but really putting emphasis on, and this is something that Guide himself said that yes, if a doctor believes that a patient would be harmed by a treatment, that it is up to them, or not necessarily incumbent upon them, but they are free to say no. And so I think that what a lot of Republicans say that essentially there's so little of that in this field that the state therefore legally is justified in preempting all that and usurping the power of parents and doctors to make decisions, private decisions on behalf of children, that the state has a just role in stepping in. And that's
Okay.
some of the legality that backs some of these court cases. That's not ultimately, that decision isn't what went into the Supreme Court, mind you. It was based on
Yeah.
sex discrimination question, but that's a due process question that's still
Yeah.
kind of like maybe filtering its way through lower courts. So
Mm.
in the statement that the Guyot team put out in August, they, said that in this case, patient autonomy was of great importance, et cetera. But they also used activist language like medically necessary, hormone replacement therapy. This is terminology that activists, and there's a lot of overlap between activists and doctors, mind you, in this field, have used absent evidence base to describe or define the outcomes of these treatments. These aren't replacement therapies because you can't replace a level of testosterone in a female that was never there. That's
Hmm.
a term that's been co-opted and bought and borrowed from menopause treatment. So that
Mm.
just drives me insane. But so, and then the last thing that they did is they gave this atonement donation to Egale Canada, which is this LGBTQ rights group, or in Canada you say, I'm trying to get it right, 2S LGBTQIA plus, because
Okay.
they had two spirit because the indigenous populations in Canada.
Yeah.
So they gave this out of their own money, and it turns out Gordon Guy gave $500 of his own money. And so to establish a financial relationship with an advocacy group that is using in their own advocacy work expressions like medically necessary and life-saving care that their own work contradicted undermines
Mm,
their own authority and calls into question how they can be an independent-minded academic about anything. If and
mm,
also, it calls into question, they stabbed Segem in the back. In a very sort of oblique reference in very sort of cryptic words. They said, like, when we first started working with Segem, and they described themselves as like non-trans cisgender academics, which seems sort of beside the point. But like as us, as non-trans cisgender academics, they seem to us to be legitimately evidence-based. But they didn't say what they meant by that. So
mm,
essentially they're saying like, we think this group is, using evidence-based, let's say it's a pretext. So Jesse Singal, the journalist, did this very long interview with Gordon Guyatt that he put on his Substack a couple weeks ago. It was really shocking that Guyatt gave this interview as Q&A published in its entirety. And he said he tried to say like, oh well, Segem, he's potentially implying that they were using all this talk about evidence-based as a pretext because they were advocating for bans. And he said he had evidence or proof of this in emails that he exchanged with them. And then he gave said emails to Jesse, and Jesse said, like, I don't see and hear anything proving what he was saying. So there's that.
mhm.
And Jesse literally got him to say, even if it weren't true that Segem were, say, anti-trans or out for bans for this type of medicine, it wouldn't matter. They still would have had to disavow them and refuse to take money from them ever again, because of their reputation. But the reputation itself isn't necessarily evidence-based. They have been tarred and feathered by activists who are
Mhm.
afraid of what the outcomes of the systematic reviews that Segem is going to commission will portend for their cause.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a lot of sort of, I don't know, like backwards circular reasoning, or how maybe you want to call it. So it really has, it basically, the Gaia group made a choice where they're going to alienate either the trans advocacy community, the trans activist community, or they alienate the people who are like skeptics of trans medicine for children, but also those who are really rigid by the book about academic independence. There's some overlap
Mm,
between these two groups. And they went with the former. I mean, with the latter, alienating the latter, they made a choice. And so they're going
mm.
to have to live with that. But basically, I mean, they were looking at having the careers of their younger academics be destroyed by this. They mean, Gordon McGuire made that extremely clear that
Okay.
the younger academics, their PhD students, and I've certainly heard this. It was somebody who told me that one of their PhD students, and they worked in the humanities, had written like one essay for a major news outlet in which they argued something that in any other field would seem reasonable, like we should make sure to study X, Y, and Z, but that is so controversial in this field that it literally could impede the trajectory of their career. It might very well end it. So many academics' careers just end after they get their doctorate,
Yeah.
burn out for them. But so this is why I wrote about this for Unheard last week. And, one of my major theses was that, amid all of the tumult and what Trump is doing to assault this entire field in the United States from the right, there still is a very alive and well field and climate of cancel culture from the left going on in this field. And it comes from all sides. This applies to journalists as well. If
Yeah.
you stick your neck out and you say anything against the party line, or what they dismiss as just asking questions, but if you actually ask what are actually substantive questions that you would ask about any other medical field about the wisdom of these treatments, they will come for you and they will try to destroy your career.
Yeah.
So, their people's livelihoods are really on the line. And that certainly happened to many people have lost everything because of this.
W- It's beyond at this point, and probably the whole time, it's beyond just individual careers. It's the legitimacy of the institutions themselves.
Yeah.
They they're leveraging, and I think Sagan was trying to do this, leverage Guyot's name
Hmm.
to
Oh
make a
yeah.
statement,
That
right?
they
Because
the thing in
Guy's
Gotham was
surprise.
shocking to so many people
Yeah.
because he was such a big deal. We couldn't believe he showed up to the conference. He swept in, he was only there for a few hours and swept out. We're like, wow, this God
Yeah.
figures,
He's a big
gave
honcho.
us an audience. He is.
Yeah.
But also he was kind of asleep at the wheel from by his own admission. He claims, granted, maybe he's not telling the truth, but he claims that he did not even know that Segum had given this commission that had paid for this review papers. He didn't know this until earlier this year, despite the fact that the contract was signed for the commission in 2021. It was one of his,
Hmm.
I guess, more middle-aged underlings that was running the whole project. But his name's on it. It's his lab, so it's his
Yeah.
reputation at stake. But he made very clear when he came to the conference that he's like, I don't know much about this field at all.
Yeah.
Basically a total neophyte to this. So if I say anything that seems, totally out of bounds, just tell me. Like but it seemed like he had maintained that level of ignorance, and people like her name is Romina, and I forgot it's a hyphenated last name. It's something Peterson. It's like Brignandello Peterson, but she was rather controversially the author of the review that the Florida Department of Health commissioned from McMaster that ultimately led that state's, I guess it was their health board to ban these treatments. And she has a DDS. So she's ultimately like a dentist by training, but she's also been training at McMaster, the premier place in the world to get training in systematic literature review writing. So she was dismissed by Meredith McNamara, in particular, this Yale pediatrician, as being, just a dentist. Like, why would we care what a dentist thinks? And that was totally beside the point. Like, she didn't have the subject matter expertise, but that is not required to write a systematic literature review. In some way, is for the best because then you don't have any professional biases. And the
Yes.
hysterical thing about Meredith McNamara, she's this pediatrician at Yale, and she's, is always like an expert witness in all these cases, testifying on behalf of, supporting these treatments for kids. But in a deposition in Alabama court case over their ban, it's very aggressive attorney general there, under great pressuring, admitted
Hmm.
that she had never herself treated a trans child. And that she had referred two or three out to a gender clinic. She's a
Okay.
pediatrician. She doesn't do these type of prescriptions. So, but it was hysterical because she, at least in this particular case, had made such a big point of somebody not being a subject matter expertise, but the same criticism very secretly applied to her.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of these things that people aren't really mentioning unless
I
they're under
guess it's not
pressure.
possible to reform the scientific community, the academic scientific community, to be immune from whatever this is, this manipulation.
I mean, I would call
Everybody,
it just activism infusing the sciences.
yeah,
So
but they're leveraging people's. I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this, but these scientists, these academics, they're very credential based.
yeah,
They're
credentialism is very
very
big. Yeah,
huge pecking order.
yeah,
And everybody's is kind of, you have to have the letters behind your name,
hmm,
and it's all this. It's a social phenomena, but it produces the science that we
yeah,
base our medicine on, and
yeah,
so it just seems like it's inherently corrupted by the human
yeah. I
stain in
mean,
a way. And I wonder if you can reform that at all.
I don't know if you ever read *Sapiens* by Harari.
No,
He talks
but I know
about
he
what are
is.
called fictions. So, a car is something real, you can tangible it, you can touch it. You and I, our bodies are real. But the idea like of a nation is a fiction,
Yeah,
and the reason why the rule of law works is because communally we believe in it. And you hear that a lot about like the breakdown of institutions. If you don't trust the Bureau of Labor Statistics anymore, this will throw all the financial system into chaos, etc. So
yeah,
I think it's really similar. Like a DDS is a fiction in the sense that like it requires the belief in it for it to have meaning. If you believe that your doctor that his MD means that he can be trusted to take out your kidney, then you're going to submit yourself to that. But if that trust is broken down, there are so many different it, sort of downstream effects of that. And I think we're seeing that kind of breakdown right now with the rise of RFK and
hmm.
that kind of breakdown of trust is leading to total chaos inside the CDC. Because I mean, part of the problem is that again, like looking at Manichaean thinking, just black or white thinking, during the pandemic, yes, the CDC made verifiable mistakes, and then they change their tune on things. They contradict themselves. They'll say one thing and turns out there were FOIA requests of their emails saying they were saying the opposite. So a lot of this happened, and there wasn't, enough kind of atonement or acknowledgement of mistakes that were made, or, school shutdowns were never effective, that kind of thing. And so you get, I think, one could say an overcorrection in the other direction, where
Mm,
someone comes in with RFK who has no medical experience whatsoever, which leads to even more breakdown of trust. So, I mean,
mm,
RFK, for all we know, it's just the beginning of a cycle of breakdown of trust rather than the pinnacle of it. So, you
hmm.
know, I, I saw this a lot, writing about HIV, where you'd see doctors. The example I always give is that when the HIV prevention pill came out, there was this widespread uniform denial amongst all the researchers that it would lead to what's called risk compensation, which is a phenomenon where if something lowers your risk of a bad outcome, like sunscreen, that people will then double down on the behavior that they were mitigating in the first place. They'll just go out in the sun for 3 times as long and then get more likely to get skin cancer. So did gay men engage in like more sexual concurrency and lower use of condoms as a result of going on the HIV prevention pill PrEP, it's called? And the answer to anyone who was paying any attention just out in the wild was absolutely. But there was a uniform denial of this in the research community,
Hmm.
because I think they didn't want to hurt the PrEP brand. It was more important to them to get PrEP off the ground and to make sure there weren't any naysayers that were getting in the way, if they'd be in the policy realm or whatever, in the press, so that we could get this very useful drug into people's hands. So that they're clearly, and I don't think anyone ever acknowledged this internally, but there was clearly that little bargain going on inside,
Hmm.
but that, and I don't think more people than just me and a few others really recognized this was going on. But that at least got me questioning about always
Yeah.
trusting whatever some researcher says. And here we are today, where so much of what I do is scrutinizing whatever someone with a PhD says. And I have, my father's a doctor, my mother was in a PhD program right before she died, and you know, my brother's a doctor. So like I have great admiration and great awe of the work that goes into this, but it's not foolproof, of course.
Hmm. Hmm.
So and it's difficult because I think at an individual level, like the kind of overcorrection you can see is the do your own research types who then don't take on faith very good recommendations that are coming from their doctor. You think of the most classic examples of this is Steve Jobs. He's got
Yeah.
pancreatic
I
cancer,
was just thinking, yeah.
and he's sitting there doing his own research. And I ask people about that, like, might he have lived longer? Like, oh, we don't know. But like, he did not follow medical advice promptly, and he
Yeah.
was looking into, I don't know what else, kind of crystals or
Carrots or
whatever it was.
something.
God
Yeah.
knows. But that would be an extreme example of that,
Hmm.
but none of us have time to sit around reading systematic literature reviews about every little medical related decision we make. We
Yeah.
have to, just by sake of hours in the day, trust in these institutions. And that's true for the American Academy of Pediatrics. You know, all of their members don't have time to research every little type of thing that causes sniffle or whatever. They rely upon medical institutions to devise these guidelines that they can then read and follow. And
Hmm.
but it really calls into question if you've got a tiny special interest group creating this gender dysphoria, transgender kid treatment policy statement, if that's based on really shoddy research, and the citations in that paper, contradict what it says entirely, or some of them, you look at one where it says that conversion therapy is harmful. That's when you like try to force somebody to change their gender identity or sexual orientation. Conversion therapy is harmful for trans youth. If you look at the footnote of that, it's right there at the bottom. It says, like conversion therapy practices in adult homosexual men. So it was about adults
Hmm.
and it was about gay people. And at the time that policy statement was written, there weren't any studies about conversion therapy in trans youth. And I am absolutely not saying that like one should engage in conversion therapy, but what I am saying is that if you're going to cite this in a major policy statement, on behalf of this enormously powerful U.S. institution, like you should probably, cross your T's. And they were challenged on that by this paper that came out the following year by James Cantor, who's this sex researcher from Canada. It's published in peer review journal, and they have never responded to it, never said one word. and they reaffirmed the policy statement in
Oh,
2023.
okay.
And then they said they were going to conduct a systematic literature review,
I remember
despite the
that.
fact that they hadn't done so before they wrote it in the first place. And there is absolutely no sign that they have started that review. They might have,
Huh.
but typically systematic reviews will publish their protocol in advance on a site called Prospero, and there's no sign that the AAP has done this.
Okay. So back to Sagam's contracting with
Mhm.
Guyot's team.
Yeah.
They produced 5 studies, I believe you said, about
There are
binding and
two more that are pending.
tucking.
They're very close to
Okay.
publication, and Guyat's team has been trying to divorce themselves. One of them, the binding and tucking paper, all the McMaster people want their name off the paper, and it leaves only two researchers. One is an independent researcher, another one is a plastic surgeon. But between the two of them, their work didn't cover the whole paper. So they'd have to be vouching for work, some of which they didn't do. It's a little
Yeah.
dicey. What if it's bad? Like that runs off on
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
So there's that. And then the other paper about social transition, it's unclear to me there were conflicting things I was hearing about whether it'll see the light of day or not. But there are also papers that individual McMaster researchers, some of them I think are like part-time there or something, that they received individual commissions from SEGA, not a part of this main one that did the 5 systematic reviews.
Hmm.
So McMaster is also trying to torpedo that. There's one where they've been analyzing the WPATH's trans care guidelines that came out in 2022, their adolescent chapter, very controversial piece of work there. That might never see the light of day. So, a lot of work is, years of people's lives are being torpedoed
Yeah. Not to
in the
mention all
process.
of the truth that could be.
Yeah, well, unfortunately for them, McMaster is a public university, which means that you can submit public records requests. So,
Okay.
it could very well be possible. I mean, it might be end up being redacted or something, but that you could obtain drafts of these documents if you
Okay.
ask
Did
the
they?
right way.
Did Guyot only disassociate himself or distance himself
Mm.
from Sagam or from the research itself? Did they retract
Um,
the evidence? Is the evidence of the papers that they did put
it,
out
That is,
there
the
now?
activists have been demanding retractions. They did not call for that, but they are looking, it's still unclear, but they're essentially looking to publish letters to the editor in all the journals that either or have published or will publish their work that essentially recapitulates what they said in that statement in August, which is saying how they think it should or should not be used and, all that
Okay.
stuff. And
They
so
can
not a
editorialize on
total
top of it.
disavowal
Yeah.
of stuff that's already out. It would be very hard. I don't know enough, but to ask for a retraction of your own work, absent the work itself being faulty, you
Yeah.
know. So because whereas there was one paper that came out like scrutinizing the mastectomy paper, for example, review, for example. So, that has been officially criticized, and whether people agree with that or not. But I read the paper, the critique, and in no way did it say, therefore, this entire paper should be scuttled. But,
Hmm.
it takes a lot to retract a paper. It's a very big deal and a stain in somebody's career. So,
Yeah.
but McMaster remains under pressure. There's this big sign-on letter demanding that McMaster itself get these papers retracted. And this is being signed by all these academics. Florence Ashley is the most notable name. She's this activist academic at University of Alberta. The problem is, and you're saying like, okay, so you guys are academics for the most part who signed this. Like, where's your proof that this should be retracted, absent the fact that it was associated by the bad people,
Hmm.
But they had total autonomy. Once they were up and running, they were able to do whatever they wanted. And, they had to, by the way, they were under contract to publish whatever they found. But also, if the findings weren't necessarily to Segam's liking, they still could publish them under contract,
Hmm.
which is in contrast to the WPATH, World Professional Association for Transgender Health. They commissioned all these systematic reviews some years ago about trans care, and then they didn't like the findings very much. They commissioned them from Johns Hopkins, and then they started to meddle with the process, and they started to change the terms, saying that we have to, scrutinize and review the draft, and we can't publish anything that we don't like that doesn't support trans care and all this stuff. And then they made them publish it with a disclaimer saying that only the authors of the paper were responsible for it, and that, which was a
Mm.
lie. And we found all this out through subpoena documents that the very aggressive Attorney General from Alabama got last year. So it's funny to sort of measure those two things in opposition to one another, about like
Wow.
who is suppressing versus publishing
Yeah,
these
well, you talk
systematic
about a
reviews and
social
why.
contagion among teenage girls wanting a beard all of a sudden, but there's a total social contagion within the medical industry itself called activism.
Well, yeah, I would argue that activism, at least in like infectious disease and these kind of sort of social overlap between social science and medicine absolutely is very activist
Hmm.
infused. Um, and in some ways, I guess you could argue it sort of has to be because it's become so politicized from the other side. And there's
Yeah.
there's a lot of debate about that, I think. And transgender children are the center of this, of like, did the woke left provoke the woke right? Woke right being defined, is sort of a mirror image of the woke left, or obsession with identities and cancel culture and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Would Trump 2 have ever happened had, the type of progressivism that came out of 2020 and really peaked that year had inspired backlash? Would that have ultimately alienated enough people to cause Trump to be reelected? It's that debate's a little thrown off by the fact, wait, well, Biden won in 2020, so maybe though you could argue, well, it took a little bit longer to percolate to alienate enough people for Trump to win then. And
Hmm.
that Biden certainly about the trans stuff, himself was very aggressive in his executive orders and the way he was trying to change different regulations, to put trans kids in sports and that kind of thing, uh,
Hmm.
you know, bathrooms and all that stuff. So, as aggressive as Trump has been in his own way, not as aggressive, the Biden also, leveraged the power of the executive to try to make things, the way that the left wanted it when it came to trans inclusion, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you've been embroiled in this topic for how long? Yeah,
I
what did
started
you say?
researching it really in
2 3?
depth at the end of 2022, and then
Okay.
it was really a year before I started writing about it.
Yeah.
First, it was hard to find publications that would let me, because the left-wing ones were not too receptive,
Yeah.
and so I finally started mostly for writing for right-wing publications, for the New York
Hmm.
Sun, and I've written also some for Washington Post, which who knows where they land these days politically,
Yeah.
but and I just wrote a piece for Unheard, so. Um, I try to be, as neutral as possible, and I'm always making sure to strip out incendiary language, hyperbolic terms, use neutral terms. So it's, not my place to sort of take sides, but the places where I have receptive editors for that are on the right. The left
Hmm.
have made very clear that they're too scared to do it.
Oh,
Either they're scared of the
scared.
younger staffers, they're scared of GLAAD.
Yeah.
There's, a very real chance that it could really wreck their careers, and they don't want to do that. So,
And you're not concerned with career
um,
wreckage.
I mean, for me, I've certainly had suffered just, extraordinary slings and arrows and constantly being subjected to false accusations and weird types of abuse
Yeah.
online and that sort of thing. And, sometimes it impacts my personal life. But in terms of the doors that have been opened to me, um, for writing about other topics, I've never found that one has been closed because of my work in this field. So
Okay.
that's been reassuring. The
Hmm.
major relationships that I have with, left-wing mainstream media outlets, have all maintained. So
Just
that's
not
that's
on
been nice.
this
Yeah.
issue. What are the other issues that
Right.
you branched out
Well,
into?
I still write about infectious disease a lot, or write about HIV, sometimes like gay health. But I read just stuff about just the healthcare industry, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
you know, there's a little bit
Do
of political reporting.
I guess just within the gender domain, are you think you'll be done with it, like in the form of a book? Do you think it'll kind of climax with a
Yeah, I
systematic
don't
review
know.
of all of your
Well,
articles, kind of thing?
Jesse Singal's writing a book, and so is Lisa Davis, another writer in this field. So I kind of feel like that once their books come out, I don't know what they'll be left to
Oh, okay.
say,
Yeah.
but I don't really want to sit around writing a book because my friends like never write a book. Oh, great. So then, all 6,000 people who finish your book will have read it. So
Yeah.
I take that very much to heart. The idea of having written a book seems nice. You're like, and he's
Yeah.
the author of, but beyond
Yeah.
that, I'm like, what? I don't want to pull myself away from the action in the front lines
Okay.
to
All right.
working on a
Yeah,
book
you're a war
forever.
correspondent kind of guy
There,
then.
just there's so much going on right now that is very in the present moment that I wouldn't want to miss.
Yeah.
Maybe later you're sort of like, God, I'm sick of these, short deadlines, and now I want to go off into the cabin of the woods, but we'll see.
Yeah.
But
What is there like a theme? You said we talked about the topic, infectious disease, the different bureaucracies that control
mhm,
these things. Is there a theme that
yeah.
you see across all these different topics within healthcare?
I guess that it's so salient right now is, I guess, the idea of trust in institutions. And this
Yeah.
isn't necessarily like the thing guiding what I write about, but I think that
Yeah.
that is so prevailingly important right now to Americans and is really causing a lot of pain and suffering. You
Like
see
how?
these, oh, you hear these parents, their kid died of measles, and they, would you do it again? Would you not vaccinate your kid? And they're like, yes. I mean, this happened. And
Yeah.
so there are very real, sometimes life and death consequences to losing trust in medical advice and not being able to discern good from bad advice. So, that's a real tragedy. So,
Mm.
if I had it in my own life, so I've, had cancer, and I was told by Sloan Kettering that we prefer you get two chemo drugs for 4 cycles instead of 3 drugs for 3 cycles. And here are the trade-offs. You'd lose this one drug, which could cause you blue toes and fingers for the rest of your life, possibly, and possibly get lung fibrosis, and you would always be wheezing. And these, of course, risks. This isn't a guarantee. Versus, with a 4th cycle, you'd be more likely to get neuropathy and hearing loss. So, it's a gamble. And you're like, and also you'd be a hell of a lot sicker in the short term. And all I knew was that they were basing this on their own clinical opinion, which was, based on manifold experience because they're Sloan Kettering.
Mm.
But I had to make that decision under duress, uh, quickly. So,
Hmm.
I have experience and I live with neuropathy as a result. So I know what it's like to have to wonder why, what might have been,
Yeah.
and to know that my life has been guided by clinical opinion. And that, but my life, the alternative course might have been worse. I might have blue
Mm.
toes and fingers and not be able to climb stairs very well. So,
Mm.
who knows? So,
Do
these,
you trust? I guess you're a trust but verify at this point, because you do a lot of skeptical writing,
I
but
think
I'm
that's a
sure
very
it
good way of
sounds
putting
like
it.
you still have a trust.
I do. I'm on a GLP-1. I have, the reason why I have a scratchy voice is because I have sleep apnea. And so I'm constantly waking up and expelling air and shouting while I'm sleeping. So
Hmm.
I went on GLP-1 earlier this year. So, and the doctor said to me, like, well, we don't have long-term data on these, and there might be something that comes up later where everyone regrets it, along the line of Vioxx
What's
or
GLP-1?
the
Sure.
like Ozempic and those drugs, the
Okay.
weight loss drugs. So, in theory, if you lose a bunch of weight, it can improve your sleep apnea. We'll
Yeah.
see. I've lost like 15 pounds, but um, so, and that's one of those things you're like, I trust these people, like it's worth it. I'd rather be thin now than we'll see. So
Yeah.
yeah, there are plenty of circumstances where I put a lot of trust in medicine, or I
Yeah.
have to. But I think that is a good way of putting it, trust but verify.
Yeah.
Um,
What's your most enjoyable part of the work that you do for you?
I think this is like a sense of mastery when you've mastered a subject very well,
Hmm.
and you're figuring out a puzzle. I remember my mother, I didn't really like playing with toys when I was a kid. I wasn't like into action figures. I like puzzles, so
Hmm.
being able to have a project when you solve something and put it together. I remember in 2019, it took a this was like an open secret in the HIV world in Florida. In 2016, the Rick Scott's gubernatorial administration had blocked millions of dollars of CDC grants that these counties or nonprofits could have received for HIV prevention. And uh, and so I've been trying to prove this for a long time. And then finally, like the person who worked in that department had left, which meant she was now free to talk, like 3 years later. And I'd gotten her to tell me what happened. Turns out there was even more money. It was $70 million, all these different ways. And I finally was on the phone, and I was in Kenya of all places, uh, and talking to these people. It was like the middle of the night there, who were at HHS, who had known this all along. They were at HRSA, the Health Resources Services Administration, and they had known this all along. But it was sort of like, one of those fairy tales in The Old Man and the Mountain Pass, where you have to ask the right riddle. You have to learn how to ask them the right question. And
Yeah.
like, did was this money ultimately effectively blocked by the Rick Scott's administration, and did it not go out to the state? And I think they just said yes. And I just couldn't believe it. Was so thrilling. And then,
Mm.
a couple months later, the story comes out. It's a big deal, and everyone makes a fuss over it. So it's it was so strange to me at the time. It was really on the up and up as a reporter. It's the first time I'd really like had a big story that made an impact. Everybody's talking about. To think that I had done this mostly just from my bedroom, sitting there in
Mm.
Midtown Manhattan, and to have that level of influence when you have long felt very meek is very empowering.
Yeah.
When you're on like a righteous cause. I think a lot of people misuse that type of power in the media. I mean, just think of like Perez Hilton, let's just say, people who just wreck people's lives just for the fun of it and for the clicks. So,
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
certainly very important to me to be on a righteous cause. And there are plenty of people, accuse me the opposite, what you're doing is you're harming trans kids or whatever. But back to your earlier statement, like when it comes to, I saw this over the weekend, someone was brandishing a t-shirt that said support trans kids. And I'm really opposed to slogans in my writing.
Mm.
Slogans work their way into medicine all the time, and that's one of them, as is medically necessary, as is life-saving care, and in this context at least. And so when you say trans kids, what do you mean exactly? Like what we're talking about, if we're going to zoom out, are a group of kids who are under significant distress. Some of them, maybe they're not distressed, they just want to be the other sex or identify as the other sex. But by and large, are kids who are going through some very difficult experiences. And the question is like, how do we best help them? And the people who are charged with doing so, are they doing a good job? How have they assessed the best way to help these people? And are they pivoting, with changing tides if like the population before them changes as it has? And the answer to a lot of that is like, apparently not.
Hmm.
They're very rigid, they're very ideological, um, and they're very inflexible. And they also forbid certain types of thinking that say the child might be wrong, for example. And so I think it's very important as a matter of principle to really scrutinize that type of behavior, because if you're going to have a medical field that gets driven by activism and not by harder science, what else might that be true about? And might that be true about you and me one day if suddenly I have a recurrence of cancer and that entire field has been taken over by zealots of some kind,
Hmm.
that would impact my life. But it's also impacting my life because the blowback, at least loss of trusted institutions, has led to an administration that is canceling cancer research left and right. For all I know, that might also impact me. So it comes in
Mm.
all from all
Yeah.
directions. So I mean,
Yeah.
the best thing hopefully a journalist can do is to try to promote transparency. And
Yeah.
then similar to, I think, what is the case for people in evidence-based medicine, it's not my job then to say what to do with it, but it's my job to promote transparency. And I think an extreme example of that is like Edward Snowden, who, not Edward Snowden, but what's the name? The very pale man who went to prison, who was
Oh, Assange.
WikiLeaks, Assange.
Yeah.
He was such a hypocrite because he was all about transparency, but like, without the necessary redactions, mind you. And then he
Hmm.
was the world's most secretive person. So that's taking that to an extreme,
Hmm.
with a heavy dose of hypocrisy. But,
Yeah.
in general, the idea with journalism is that transparency is good, and that, it's then up to society to make the best use of that transparency.
Was
So
there a time when you were more activist and you became less
yeah,
activist?
I mean,
Yeah.
I got a very viral tweet, I think it was last year, where I had read this book by a writer named Stephen Jimenez. And so Matthew Shepard, was killed in 1998 in Laramie, Wyoming, and it became this big national story because, the story was, the myth became that he was killed because he was gay and he was this very fragile and frail, young fellow. I think he was 21 years old, and he was tied to a fence. So as if he were a scarecrow, but ultimately it looked like he was crucified. So that type of image, this heartland Americana, these
Yeah.
evil, meth addicted, murdering homophobes, became a flashpoint and ultimately a catalyst in the fight for hate crimes legislation. At the time in the 90s, I think there was a real stalling of the gay agenda. AIDS, had been treatable ultimately for couple years by then. So what was next? And there was a lot of just people were just traumatized by the runoff of the AIDS epidemic. And that really catalyzed, I think, the next chapter that like teed up ultimately, gay marriage. So, but at least according to Stephen Jimenez's very thoroughly researched book, it wasn't true. He wasn't killed for being gay. He was caught up in the meth trade, between Denver, Grand Junction, and Laramie. He was like a drug mule. And these other two guys were, was fighting over money and where was the score and that kind of thing. And he had had sex with one of them before, blah blah blah. So I was in literally the front lines of a riot about Matthew Shepard's
Hmm.
death in Midtown Manhattan. I was a sophomore at Columbia at the time, and we started off as a vigil, like marching down Fifth Avenue off starting around in the Plaza Hotel area, and ultimately became so unruly that it developed into a riot, and it crippled traffic on Fifth and Sixth Avenue for hours because we kept spilling out between the avenues. And
Hmm.
I was absolutely on the front lines, and I was literally like r wrestling with a cop with a billy club who was trying to prevent us from going on to Sixth Avenue. And I really, I don't remember if it was that cop exactly, but someone as we're standing off with these cops, uh, this woman says to me, she goes, "Don't do this. You're gonna get in trouble." I thought it was very sweet for her to think about us in that way. It really was very nice. And granted, there were a lot of people who were very critical of the cops, and they stormed in with like the cavalry with these horses, and some people were, I guess, stepped on. My experience with the cops was like they were doing their jobs. We were being ruffians. I mean, like, what would you do? You'd try to stop us,
Yeah.
But there was a picture of me in the Daily News the next day with like this car. And the thing is, at that age, I found this very glamorous, and I knew exactly what I was doing. I was
Yeah.
in the paper, no different papers over time, my early 20s, no fewer than four times with that exact pose,
Hmm.
because I knew that if you do that, they're like, we got the shot, we can go home. You can tell photographers were waiting for some good iconic shot, and you give it to them. It's like giving a good quote.
Yeah.
So it was sort of a trick, but over the years, I mean, that I had tweeted about this. I was like, here I am. This is a photograph of me from that day that I'd found, uh, and being all activisty. And then I found out what we were fighting over probably wasn't true. And it was this huge outpouring over this tweet because people were very impressed that someone from the left would admit they were wrong, essentially,
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
something that was like the cornerstone of left activism for so long and remains to this day. But yeah, I became disillusioned over time with activism, in part because I just said, like, I don't relate to this, banging the pots and pans in the streets, especially as the internet era wore on. You're like, isn't
Hmm.
this rather antiquated? Aren't you better just like stirring up some viral tweets, like
Yeah.
wouldn't that be
Yeah.
more effective than just yelling at some people and hoping somebody covers it? To this day, you go on Blue Sky and there'll be all these complaints whenever there's a big protest. I can't believe it. This is the front page of CNN and all these other publications, and not one person has said one thing about our march. I'm like, you guys still think that marches are a big deal? Like they're so perfunctory. I remember going to the 2003 protests in DC over the Iraq War. It was like 7 degrees out that day. Got on the bus in New York. The bus broke down. We're freezing in the bus. Finally got there. We get out. We're like this. We march. There are some signs. It's a weekend, so everyone in DC is just like gone, you
Yeah.
know. And then we get back in the bus and we leave. And I'm like, we might as well have been in a hermetically sealed tube that entire
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Nobody saw us, nobody heard us. It's totally perfunctory. And then he invaded Iraq, like, next week or
Yeah.
whatever. And so it's just like, I don't think this is very effective, and it's not the best use of my strength. And it's often, not in the case of the Iraq War, but it's often based on some really shaky concepts. I was in this dispute with this HIV activist few years ago. He was very angry that I wasn't reporting his party line about
Mm.
the HIV prevention pill in particular. And, what I was saying about Facebook and on Facebook and stuff about it, I just didn't think what he said was true. And he said something very mean to me. He said, Ben, if you were in ACT UP back in the day, we all would have died because you would have spent so much time quibbling over everything. We never would have got anything done. I'm like, well, that is extremely mean. But
Hmm.
what I said to him, I was just like, you're an activist. And he said to me, like, basically they would punch first, fact check later. That was their
Hmm.
policy.
Yeah.
And you'll see that, like, well, yes, I've seen the documentary and y'all made some mistakes. You thought everyone should get on these pills that you would order in the mail and be on monotherapy. And, actually it's probably did more harm than good.
Hmm.
Congratulations. And I said to him, and this happens all the time, you're mistaking me for an activist. So very
Yeah.
often when they say like, oh, this guy's got an agenda and he's influencing his writing for this determined outcome, and say like, no, that's you. That's what you do. You're projecting as an activist onto me as a reporter. And of course I have my own biases and have my own opinions, but like I do everything I can to try to keep them out of the writing and keep them
Hmm.
out of what I tweet. You know, and I will absolutely advocate for the truth. And if something's wrong, but I'm not going to sit there and advocate for a certain outcome or for a ban or whatever it is. And I just think that that's a much better use of my strength and
Hmm.
much better way to influence the dialogue than yelling about,
What tempered you then? I guess just
I
gradual
think
maturation
I think
or
most people as they get older tend to become a little bit more circumspect about stuff and less reactionary. Most people, not
yeah.
everyone,
No.
obviously, but
Yeah.
I think that's a general trend of getting older. Um, but I think also just whatever. I just read Summer of Our Discontent by Thomas Chatterton Williams about
Hmm.
2020, and just a lot of the basic premises that fueled the movement in the summer of 2020, and a lot of things about COVID and a lot of things about BLM were based on faulty premises, essentially, like empirically faulty. I'm not just talking about like whether you think there should be equality, but like, does this program that you're promoting work to promote
Hmm.
equality? And I think that's a really important difference. And I'll sort of say, like, well, presuming that you would like this outcome in which there's racial harmony or whatever, like, because you might not. There are plenty of people who don't, and they would rather live in
Hmm.
a white ethno state. Like, does this route of getting their work, or is approaching it from this angle going to lead to such a backlash that actually you end up worse off than you would had you done nothing?
Hmm.
That these are really important questions to ask. And they're not just asking questions, which is such a lazy way of criticizing what journalism
Hmm.
is.
Hmm.
There are some people who are just, I think it's called like sea lioning, on social media, where you just like keep pestering them with annoying questions and moving the goalposts.
Hmm.
But what real journalism is asking substantive questions
Yeah.
that lead to, you know, answers that are edifying.
Hmm. Are you happy with your impact or with the work that you've done on the gender topic?
Yeah, I guess I mean, I could certainly see, even if I'm writing for small publications, that maybe each individual article isn't necessarily read by that many people. It's
Yeah.
very abundantly clear to me that it's influencing people who are in positions of influence themselves, and there's a
Hmm.
spillover effect. And so that is very gratifying. I mean, I went to a very small school, K through 12. So, there was like, start off with like 32 kids in your class, you end up with 48 when you graduate. And you could really see the impact of your own behavior and your discourse for good or bad.
Hmm.
And so it really invites people who are up for mischief. You can get all the class to misbehave, like, or you can be a leader. So I
Hmm.
I take that very seriously, and I really have certainly seen how, I've been able to influence dialogue, and I'm not out there looking for a political outcome per se, but another thing that's really powerful is, I hear from parents all the time. It's usually mothers, but it's some dads,
Hmm.
um, who say that, my work, they find great solace because somebody
Hmm.
is taking seriously, not necessarily just directly, like they're, writing a story about their exact experience with their child or whatever. but these are parents who, let's just say, have misgivings about gender transition drugs. Some of them, I guess you could say, are full-on bigots, but others, you're like, I absolutely support the right for transgender people to exist as they choose. But, for my own child, I don't think it's in their best interest, like that kind of a thing.
Hmm.
So, seeing how that's torn apart many families. So it's very gratifying to hear from these people and to feel know that they're very often very alone in their communities. They can't talk
Hmm.
with their other parents about it, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
to feel like they've essentially been heard,
Yeah.
and looking into the kind of concerns that they have.
Hmm. What's coming up next for you? I
Um,
guess that's where we began,
yeah.
but this is
Well, I
where
mean,
we'll,
certainly the Supreme Court, now you've got court cases over the sports ban and I'm blanking the other one. And
sports ban.
well, so transgender females participating in girls and women's sports.
Yeah.
So that's coming up. And essentially seeing where the Trump administration goes from here. Will it collapse the rest of this entire field? That's certainly a great interest.
Hmm.
I've gotten much more interested in the law. I think there's a lot of overlap, but certainly between medicine and the law, and they kind of
Hmm.
rely on one another. But they're very similar in the ways that they're both, based on rules and whether people are following them.
Yeah.
So, and within those rules and the papers and the briefs and the decisions that they produce, are stories and intention. So, life or death
Hmm.
tension, or health and sickness, or guilty or innocent, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
That certainly is very interesting to me.
Huh. And you don't think he'll turn into a gendered John Grisham,
Oh,
write a
right.
thriller or
No.
two? Yeah.
No, but I think one thing I really would like to do is that, I mean, Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, certainly kicked off a lot of the scrutiny
Yeah.
of this field in 2021. I think it first came out in 2020. Sorry, something in my eye. Um,
Hmm.
I
Stop
putting
that.
that book aside, and it had a certain tone, let's just say, that was pretty incendiary. There hasn't been very much coverage in mainstream media, certainly anywhere near the left, of the experience of families who have a child who identifies as trans or gender dysphoria, in which the family is ambivalent about it. It's invariably the stories that you hear are, the kid came out, parents had trouble at first, and they came around, and they're very supportive, and now there's a crisis that's been based on politicians wherever, and now they're gonna have to flee the state, or now they're gonna have to flee the country. You see
Mm.
articles about this all the time. The New Yorker did one about fleeing Tennessee for Virginia 2 years ago, and now they did one about fleeing Maine for Mexico City. So, these stories are very powerful, but my question is, are they the typical story? If you were ever able to survey all the families who are impacted by this issue, what percentage of them are the type that are willing to pack up and move? And
Hmm.
I would bet, since people's livelihoods are on the line, all of their entrenchment or whatever community they live in, that there would be some resistance. And you never hear that story. And I find it very hard to believe that those stories aren't everywhere. I certainly hear
Hmm.
from parents, have misgivings. I hear, I haven't spoken to my child in X number of years. This led to a rupture between us, etc.
Hmm.
There was one man I interviewed. His wife had transitioned to male. I don't know if it's before or after they divorced, but they divorced in any case. They had two young children, who were, something like under the age of 10. Both the children started identifying as transgender. The ex-spouse then got together with a trans man who had a trans child. And now the oldest of the two kids was old enough to start, possibly looking at puberty blockers one day. It was in their divorce settlement that they had to have two-parent consent, mind you. So essentially it would never happen since the dad would never approve it. But
Hmm.
they were starting to have to involve a gender clinic by virtue of their divorce agreement. And the father was very unhappy with the first psychologist they'd been assigned to, and the clinic wouldn't let them switch. And I was Zooming with this guy a year ago, and the look on his face was one of such defeat and resignation of this man's entire world had been shattered. And if you're to look at a philosophical idea, if transgender identity is based on an idea of a philosophy, that there is such thing as the transgender spirit or identity, etc., this idea had come into his family and torn it apart. And now, one could argue that this idea is valid. Let's just say it's as intrinsic as being gay or as being a man, let's say. And
Hmm.
these other, I guess we're dealing with five. I guess three adults and two adults and three children between this step family
Hmm.
that all identify as transgender one way or another, that these all are valid identities. They will be indefinite, you know, or not. But it's on a philosophical level, it's certainly fascinating to ask like how an idea could have wound its way into this man's life and torn it apart.
Hmm.
So that's certainly something I'd be very interested in writing more just sociologically about.
Yeah.
Also, what's it like for these families to never have their stories represented except for in really like red meat, overly zealous right-wing reporting, like Megyn
Hmm.
Kelly sort of fire-breathing talk, like has anyone ever, you're not going to get the 2020 interview, like the Barbara Walters sit down with Jazz Jennings type of
Yeah.
interview, with, families. Actually, I take that back entirely because there was a very famous 2020 episode that talked about detransitioning a few years ago, and there
Yeah.
was all this work behind the scenes to try to stop it.
Hmm.
Um, but at least
Hmm.
where we are right now, I haven't seen it, and that's something I have to do, but I think it's 2021. Right now, we absolutely are not hearing from those stories because they're very politically inconvenient. And there are I think a lot of reporters who will say to themselves, even if I think it's perfectly valid to hear these stories and these people deserve to be heard from, right now we're just aiding and abetting the Trump administration. So therefore we're going to self-select.
Oh,
And you hear
yeah.
that a lot, like, why didn't you essentially self-edit? Why are you writing things that would aid and abet the bad guys?
Hmm.
And my response to that is like, I can't design my reporting based on political 4D chess. Like that's a
Hmm.
terrible way to go about it. And the same thing I think with researchers, you shouldn't be, deciding your outcomes in your study based on what you would rather hear. You
Hmm.
have to set yourself up to possibly be very disappointed. You
Hmm.
think of this big study that came out recently where they gave these cash supplements to these low-income families to try to study whether just
UBI
giving
or something.
cash would improve children's outcomes and their schoolwork and their mental health and that kind of thing. And the study had a null result. And this was a total shock to these people. They'd spent years and they put all this faith and all this work into hoping that this would be a great support, for the kind of left-wing support for, you know, universal basic income or whatever, or just like the kind of increased subsidies that we saw during the COVID pandemic that lifted children out of poverty. And I always think that's a weird word because like the definition of poverty is arbitrary. It's like
Mm.
$15,000 a year right now for an individual, and it's like 42,000 for a family of four or something, you know. So if you just give someone one penny that crosses them over that threshold, they're out of poverty. But is
Yeah.
their life really that different? So I always think those expressions are ridiculous. But
Yeah.
you know, researchers and journalists alike, being these similar public intellectuals exploring things, have to be comfortable with setting things up that they're, one, not going to have control of how the information is used, but
Yeah.
that also might lead to outcomes that they personally don't like very much. I just saw Amy Coney Barrett speak. She was being interviewed by Barry Weiss here in Lincoln Center in Manhattan last week. And, anyone could sort of react to this very cynically. But, she was talking about her personal morality and religious philosophy. She's, very Catholic, might often be in conflict with the law. And my reaction to that isn't necessarily just with Amy Coney Barrett, is always to say, it's funny though, how often the law does end up, you do end up rationalizing it and it synchronizing with your personal opinions,
Hmm.
So I mean, you look at like Neil Gorsuch wrote the Bostock v. Clayton County decision in 2020 that decided that the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act applied non-discrimination policies to gays and transgender people in just in an employment setting. You wouldn't have thought that he would have been that, but because he's such like a textualist, he
Hmm.
ultimately
Hmm.
decided that was the outcome. So, there sometimes you are surprised, but it is interesting, like how there does
Hmm.
seem to be a strong correlation between what arcane legal theories you come up with and how to. I was just reading this thing about the difference of on the basis of sex and because of sex. And they're trying to say that there's a substantive difference between those two.
Yes. Yeah.
One is Title IX, and one's Title IX, one's Title VII, I think. Uh, and in these decisions having to do with this rule in the Affordable Care Act about non-discrimination policies and whether they should be based more than just sex, but also gender identity and sexual orientation. And these decisions, they're saying, oh, well, there's a difference because of and on the basis of. And yet the Supreme Court has used them interchangeably and explicitly said that
Mm,
they're synonyms, you know. So like
mm-hmm,
that's the kind of
mm-hmm.
thing where it's like you can very quietly, based on like some totally vague, you know, vague words that are, you know, that you can interpret one way or another, wind up with the opinion that
Yeah,
you prefer, you know.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The law is very powerful in
I mean, it's
its
about
effects, but it's
language, you
very,
know,
yeah, it's very
but
manipulatable.
a lot of it you'll see is just that, like, God, if only when they'd written this law in the first place, they would have been more specific. We wouldn't be where we are now.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm. Well, yeah, but I'm sure human beings will figure out another in specific place because we'll get what
well,
we want out of it, right?
I just mean like, I mean, the Constitution is the classic example of something that's written pretty damn vaguely. It's quite short for something that important, you know.
Hmm.
And I guess they wanted it to be up to interpretation. We'd figure it out as we go along. But like, you know,
Yeah.
there's a comma in the Second Amendment. Like, if it wasn't there, none of this would have happened. Seriously, you know, and we can't quite figure out like whoever wrote this was out of their minds. You know, what exactly were they saying about these militias? You know, I don't know, but it's
Yeah.
Jeffrey Toobin wrote a great article for the New Yorker about 15 years ago or 10 years ago about how essentially once the NRA changed from being a sportsman, sort of curiosity organization to being all out for gun rights, which was basically like a response to the Black Power movement and white people being scared that the blacks love the guns. Um, you know, they spent a 50-year project and, you know, the Heritage Foundation and all these ways of influencing the judiciary to totally flip the meaning of the Second Amendment such that it would defend individual right to bear arms. And that's ultimately what happened in that case and based in Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
law, I think. So it's certainly fascinating to watch how, you know, such a vague couple of sentences in that amendment uh,
Hmm.
can be flipped on their heads based on what behind the scenes is clearly a brazen political project, but which
Hmm.
seems ultimately when it filters down through these judges in the end to be objective. And
Hmm.
that's what they claim.
Hmm.
Oh, they're textualists and we want to know what they originally meant. But really, they're just being influenced over the years, you
Hmm.
know, by all of
Hmm.
this money that's being, I mean,
Money and
you know, all
propaganda.
power to the Republicans. They had a very successful, decades-long political project to influence the judiciary that the Democrats just like never had a handle on.
Hmm.
And that's what we're living with now is the Heritage Foundation and being founded, I think, in the 70s. And just from the ground up. And you see it also just with they influence school boards and on up to the city council. And so like the pipeline for Republican power is much more robust. You know, we wonder like, is there anybody else than like Gavin Newsom and Pete Buttigieg who could possibly run for president? And part of the reason the Democrats are in this stick is like just less of a pipeline in the first place. And that's something that, you know, takes place over the period of 15 to
Hmm.
20 years of somebody's
Well, they've
career.
been concentrating on the institutions, academic institutions, less
Certainly.
than,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, the
yeah,
power structure is really focused in academia. And then so,
yeah,
but, you
and
know,
media.
Republicans like, oh, we're going to undo this by pummeling them to death. I'm like, well, are you also, where are all these academics who are going to populate Harvard who
Yeah.
are, you know, abject conservatives? Like, do they exist? I don't know. Or does the very fact of receiving a higher level education ultimately produce somebody who tends to think, irrespective of like being counseled to think one way or another, does a higher level education, you know, by and large tend to produce people who think, you know, in left-wing manner. You know, that
Hmm.
one could argue that, but
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
went to college before the days where anyone talked about politics in school. So like I don't know anything about this colonization or decolonization. It never came up. We were just talking about Shakespeare. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ben, Ryan, great to catch up with you again.
yeah,
Is there a repository where all your
yes.
articles are kept?
And
And
my
where is that?
website is benryan.net. And my
Net.
Substack, yeah, the com was taken. You know, one of these days that guy's gonna kick the bucket. And and that's good. We have a good murder mystery. Was it like, did he really want the web address? You know, but and then my Substack where I read about pediatric gender medicine is benryan.substack.com. And my Blue Sky, which I don't use that very much, but my Twitter X is Ben Ryan Writer.
Hmm. Do your articles, like speaking genre or style
Mhm.
level, Are they evenly distributed between more biographical story, day in the life of,
I
and
don't do that
then this
much. I
other
really,
kind of news reporting? Are you drawn to that more? Like this is
I
how?
I like doing that. It just doesn't just the because I write so much about studies or court
Yeah.
cases
Okay.
and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So it tends to be a lot less of that.
Do you
So
want
and
to go in that direction?
I mean,
Because it
I
sounds like
enjoy that.
that's what
It's,
you're.
it
Yeah.
certainly is interesting to write about people's lives more than just
Yeah.
like, procedures, higher level procedures that, have a downstream effect on individual people. But
Yeah.
it can also be very difficult to get sources about certain things because
Yeah.
the activists have such a hold on journalism in the regards to making sure that you're blacklisted in certain corners
Mm-hmm.
if
Mm-hmm.
you've written for the bad people or written about the bad things.
Yeah.
So HIV advocates. There's one piece that's called I can't remember the headline, but something about like they're still trying to cancel me or something like that I wrote in my Substack earlier this year. But I was on this Zoom. It was a Zoom session with some sort of HIV issue this summer, and there was this person who's worked in HIV advocacy, forever, who I've known perfectly in a perfectly decent relationship with professionally for many years, who saw that my name was in the list of people in the chat log or whatever, and said like I refuse to present during this session. Ben Ryan is still on the call. And I think the guy running it, who doesn't like me, um, I think he actually might not have had the capability to kick me off, and that might have been the problem. But he said no, and the guy did. He refused to participate, and his
Mm.
colleague did. And it was he's the one who suffered in the end. I was still on the call. Everyone else went about their business. But then we
Yeah.
didn't get to hear from him. But that happens so often where, I'll be writing about something that has nothing to do with gender medicine, but HIV has such a heavy overlap with HIV activism. You know, if it the HIV if I'm requiring HIV advocates for sources, they'll refuse to talk to me, and in the end, all it means is their voices aren't heard.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what it really boils down to is they cannot be seen associating with me. And sometimes I'll sort of cheat a little bit where I'll like go on a Zoom that they're on and I'll quote from them from there. And they'll still end up in my article and they didn't die in the end. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
I'll even like ask them a direct question and they're perfectly nice to me on the Zoom, even though they wouldn't return any of my phone calls. So,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really about ideological conformity, and
Mm-hmm.
that is such a powerful effect in those realms of academia
Mm-hmm.
and medicine is not being seen aiding and abetting the bad people.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's very Red Scare like. And I always used to sort of imagine learning about the Red Scare growing up, like, gee, what would I have done?
Yeah.
Would I refuse to name names and that kind of thing? That
Mm-hmm.
Woody Allen line. Then you're up next and you're in a committee naming names. And at least in this small, and this is certainly not as bad as the Red Scare, being dragged before HUAC or whatever. But, I'm like, no, I would not have, like I did stick to my principles and I
Yeah.
have paid a price in certain ways. And it's certainly been very inconvenient to my
Yeah.
reporting where there was one story, it was for a major publication. It was this very niche HIV issue. And like it was probably the only time that anyone is ever going to write about these people's very niche issue, which they obsessed about all day long. And they were all in the same listservs. They were able to coordinate stonewalling me. And I had two
Hmm.
moles who one of them double crossed me in the end, but the other mole stuck with me to the end. Uh, and they explained to me that like the reason why, even if I wanted to, I couldn't be in your piece on the record is because if I did, I'd get kicked out of the group,
Mm-hmm.
for talking to you. I'm like, that
Mm-hmm.
makes a lot of sense. And I did find one person to go on the record, and that person told me, she's like, she was in academia, and she's like, I think it's ridiculous, this whole campaign against you. And then a year later, she joined the campaign and refused to talk to me. And that's who
Mm.
I quoted from that person by getting them off of a Zoom call. So
Oh, okay.
outsmarted them. Um, but but it's silly because like there are no winners and the only loser is them,
Because they're
because
sad
their
sack
voices aren't
gang.
heard. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
one thing if I was like a terrible reporter in the sense of always getting anything wrong, and wrote in this really inflammatory, horrible style where it's like, of course you would never want to be quoted, by at this point, Tucker Carlson or something who's just like totally off the rails,
Yeah.
but that's absolutely not the way I write. So, and that's certainly this particular piece, was again like their only chance to have anybody at a major outlet learn about their particular niche subject. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
but it's they're so much more invested in shooting themselves in the foot for the sake of ideological conformity and being seen as ideological conformative.
Yeah.
Um, it's the tribalism is very important. I was talking with this guy over the weekend who's like sort of conservative, and he just moved here from a different country, and he was saying like in the country where he was from, his he's probably center right, let's just say, or a hair right of center. He would say his opinions and everyone sort of nod. And here in the US, he was practically sort of shouted out of rooms, and people were like, I can't have anything to do with you immediately. And he's being counseled like in this country, we don't that this doesn't go over well in Manhattan. And
Hmm.
I think that's, you know, people think in such a Manichaean way, especially about the Trump administration, that there's nothing the Trump administration could ever do that had any redeeming quality, and ever saying and saying anything about them that might even suggest that means you validate the entire package, fascism and all this sort of stuff,
Hmm.
militarization of the police and tearing apart immigrant families or whatever. So, and I don't see how that type of kind of closed-mindedness is really going to help anybody understand our political reality any better if you
Hmm.
don't expose yourself to contrasting points of view, nothing else. Feel free to disagree and strongly and tell them that,
Yeah.
but to refuse to even hear it, that's not going to a good place.
Hmm. What about editorial? Do you ever just let down your hair and get a little inflammatory? Just let
I
yourself
try
go
not to. I
off
mean,
on.
it's just like, it's just sort of a
Because
sheer
it hurt your brand, but I mean, do you
yeah,
ever
I mean,
like
it's
want
like
to have
not
an
just a
opinion?
brand, but like, it can hurt relationships
Your
with
voice.
publications.
Oh, yes.
Like,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
not just like, I, I mean, I do sort of follow those kind of contributors guidelines to publications, which say like don't be political, but it's to my benefit in the end because similar to what we were talking about with Gordon Guyatt, maintaining an independence from politics, you
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
improves your own credibility. People, some people will listen to you and they'll say like, no, that guy's not some raging political activist.
Hmm.
If you actually read his writing, he's very
Yeah.
neutral,
Yeah.
like, and so people will notice that and they'll appreciate it. So,
The long
that's
game.
very important for my own legitimacy. But there's so many people who very genuinely believe that if the New York Times had run a banner headline every single day of the Trump administration, the first one, fascism afoot or, evil people, everywhere, that kind of thing. If that ever, I remember it was October of 1998. There was a record, it was like 16 days of banner headlines of like all caps, the New York Times, because like it was like Monica Lewinsky and Bosnia bombing. But anyway, if it was like that every day, that enough people would have been like, this is terrible. We must mobilize. And then they would get the project done, whatever they're trying to do. And then Trump would never be heard from again. So there are a lot of people, and I'm not exaggerating at all, like very genuinely believe this, and they'll say this all the time. And my response to that is like, well, A, did every day qualify for banner headline? Putting that aside, if the New York Times and other, major news sources that people rely on for hopefully some form of unbiased news
Hmm.
become political, that undermines their credibility. It's people have bad enough trust in the media as it is.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
don't want to like give them any more red meat by then becoming explicitly political in what you write. And then
Yeah.
people have a problem with different, they don't understand that the opinion section is different from the news section in the
Yeah.
Times, for example, but that's kind of on them. But there is a firewall. But it is to society's benefit to have some news sources that aren't CNN and aren't MSNBC, and that are doing their damnedest to report the news as it is to let
Hmm.
you decide, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, and oftentimes I'm sure that conflicts with what they would prefer politically as journalists. And that's a part of the job. And if you're a good journalist, you can put that aside, just as if you were an attorney and arguing
Mm.
a case, for a client that you thought was bad for some reason.
Hmm.
It reminds me of in Reversal of Fortune, which is this great movie about Alan Dershowitz getting a new trial for Klaus von Bülow, who may or may not have killed his heiress wife, Sonny von Bülow, with an injection of insulin. In the end, when he does get a new trial, he says to him, Klaus, legally, this was an important victory. Morally, you're on your own. And being able to distinguish from the two, there's this Felicity
Mm-hmm.
Huffman's character in the film. He's like, why are we just defending somebody? He had a trial and he was guilty. And he's like, that's the basis of the whole legal system. Did he have a fair trial? And that's, if everyone thought that way, there wouldn't be any defense attorneys. And defense attorneys are there, you know, for the larger purpose is for the defense of democracy,
Mm-hmm.
to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that people get fair defenses and, that they benefit from due process. So, similar with journalists, like we're not there to conduct the trial for you, we're
Mm-hmm.
there to explain it to you, and then
Mm-hmm.
hopefully you can make your decision.
Yeah. Have you been tempted by a piece of evidence that really contradicts your worldview
I'm
to
trying to
not
think.
change your worldview?
I guess whatever it was, I wouldn't tell you because I have to sort of maintain that kind of
Yes.
firewall
Okay.
myself.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know.
Are there things that you struggle with
Mm.
though on that level? Where you're like,
Well,
uh,
I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly I'm always struggling with what I think of pediatric gender medicine.
mm,
But what I can say pretty clearly, is that A, let's just say that there are plenty of children out there who are going to have gender dysphoria indefinitely. And their lives would be much easier if we, from the age of 9 to 12 onward, guided them into the other puberty of the opposite sex. And
mm,
that this is absolutely represents a very fine balance of risk versus benefits. So let's just say that there are those kids out there. Okay, how are we going to find them? Is there a system by which people have been able to deduce which child is which, as opposed to the other child who would have desisted, which means to stop identifying as transgender, or detransitioning, which is when you've already transitioned. Um, but not only is there no system to try to deduce one child from another, uh, the permanently gender dysphoric versus, the temporarily one, this this entire medical project has never even tried to establish such a system. One way of doing it would be to have like very thorough survey data about a cohort that you follow over a long period of time. Or maybe you happen to have old survey data and you still
mm,
had like the cohort was all still together and you could reference back, were there any of these questions that safely predicted whether you detransitioned? It's really hard to know because like if you had never
mm,
offered them the medications in the first place, that could have
mm,
led to a different trajectory. So who's to know? But, no one is ever trying to do these types of analyses. I think in part because to do them would be to acknowledge that detransitioning is a possible outcome that's more than just rare, or that would be a bad outcome. You'll hear them sort of try to rationalize it by saying, "Oh, well, that's just the latest step in their gender journey." Like,
mm,
yeah, now they
mm,
don't have any breasts, and
mm,
and Prisha Mosley is a very famous detransitioner, suing her care providers in North Carolina, had a mastectomy as a minor and had a baby recently. And she still has like some milk ducts, I guess, in her chest.
mm,
But I don't know if she has nipples, but if she does, they're not connected to the milk ducts anymore because you have to sort of like take them off and put them back on, basically.
helicopter. Yeah.
And she described how painful it was to have milk accumulating in the ducts with nowhere to go.
Mm,
And that really struck me. And like to dismiss that as
it's a
just being
gender
collateral
journey.
damage or worth it. Sometimes I'll ask people, I'll be like, well, okay, in your world, what percentage of children who go through these drugs ultimately detransitioning would you be comfortable with, to say we should still
Mm,
keep doing it? And I
mm,
had one person say, uh, he said 49%. I'm like, okay. So I mean,
mm,
that's a good question to give you a sense of how you balance the risks and benefits. And he considers the ultimate product to be so important that it's worth it to have that proportion of
half
just
fail.
under a majority uh, of these negative outcomes. It was a very
Yeah.
striking answer. I'm surprised he answered it honestly,
Wow.
but I think you can
That's
kind of
fascinating.
guess it's when the word only leaves the sentence, it was only X amount detransitioned. And so only is invariably put before the word before 1%. But
Mm-hmm.
once only drops out, um,
Mm.
you'll start to get a sense of what they're comfortable with.
Oh, okay.
30%, you'll hear that figure. There was a study of some VA data. And so like VA and Kaiser Permanente are some of the only places to get good cohort data like they have in Scandinavia in the United States.
Hmm.
So it showed that after, I don't know, it was like a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, 30% of young people who had been given a cross-sex hormone prescription were no longer taking it. They don't know the answer of why, and it could be they got it from somewhere else, or they got it
Yeah.
from, they paid cash, or they left, you know, they got its insurance somewhere else. I don't know. But um, you don't hear the word only before 30%. They mostly
Hmm.
they deny that it happened, but um, so I think that's a very sort of telling, very a great tell about
Hmm.
where their priorities are, what
Hmm.
they what they think is an okay level of collateral damage. And it's also very interesting in terms of people's um, the position that they put on fertility uh, as an important facet of life. You know, it's somebody's own life as opposed to the life that they would be creating. And I think there are a lot of liberals who don't think that the capacity for reproduction is particularly important and that getting rid of it is of no real consequence ethically.
Yeah.
So you hear that very often, which sort of surprises me, because of the history of forced sterilization in this country. And one thing I just was heard from a legal expert the other day was that in this country, it is illegal to sterilize a child, absent a very good medical reason. So,
Hmm.
and this could be,
Cancers or
the
something.
cancer
Yeah.
treatment is essentially the only one
Yeah.
that's not controversial, essentially. Um, so, and in this case, when you're talking about autonomy and values and preferences that we were referring to earlier, the patient's autonomy and the values and preferences of their family are irrelevant if for some reason the family came in and said, please sterilize my child. So you get into a gray area with gender transition treatment where does that still apply? Because this isn't a fatal condition.
Mm.
Whereas the ethics are simple. So this, I mean, myself, I had testicular cancer, and so I've had half of an orchiectomy, and or at least, one of my testicles removed, and then I had chemotherapy. So before chemotherapy, I had fertility preservation. And I was 43 years old, and I didn't really want children, but decided to do it anyway. It was expensive, and it was really, embarrassing.
Hmm.
You have to march into this creepy little office and masturbate. It's not anyone's list of, well, some people probably find anyone fetishizing something, but I did not find it very sexy, let me
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
I had to summon all my old acting skills when I was a kid. Uh, so, it really begs the question of like, you know, in what scenario is it ethical for adults to decide legal on behalf of a child for that they should not be able to reproduce? Because it's the
Hmm.
adults that are making the decision legally.
Hmm.
And at what
And there's no
age?
reversing that.
Well, I mean, it's complicated, and of course, the research is very great, but it
Yeah.
every sort of level of medical reasoning you'd be able to intuit that if you take a 9-year-old boy, or let's just say 11-year-old boy who's just entered puberty, it's called Tanner stage 2.
Hmm.
So at the time, they still have what's called a micropenis, and you put them on puberty blockers, which means their penis and testicles never grow. And then you put them on estrogen. And then even if you went on off of estrogen, the kid's like 20 or something, it's not like all of a sudden then they're going to go through a male puberty. That's it. So
Hmm.
that person remains in a pre-fertile state permanently, essentially. And there's no real way. I mean, maybe one day you'll be able to do it where you could take some sort of biopsy of the testicle and, preserve it, some cryopreservation. It
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
work. You have to wait till the kids into standard 3 or preferably 4. 5 is like the end of adolescence or end of puberty. 3 or 4 is like, when boys start to masturbate. So, you have to wait until they hit that stage to be able to preserve sperm. So, but it's a little foggier with natal girls. And again, they're trending to start later also. Some of them are really at 16. So,
Hmm.
but it's at least theoretical that having a high level of testosterone in your body is going to possibly damage your reproductive system as a natal female, in whatever capacity. So, and it certainly does say damage like the vaginal tissues, causes vaginal dryness and thinning of vaginal wall, the cases of, like severe bleeding after intercourse, for example.
Yeah.
So, that is a very well known impact. I suppose you can treat it with some sort of like estrogen jail or something. But
Yeah, but just the context of taking somebody's or damaging somebody's fertility
mhm.
is suspended in this instance, or
I
it's
mean,
already
it's what they say
downgraded.
is, when in these papers where they'll examine these issues, the conclusion is invariably, therefore, fertility counseling is advised for young people.
Yeah,
And by the
yeah.
way, the fertility counseling, as far as I can tell from the papers I read, is very thinly applied, mind you. And actual fertility preservation is quite uncommon in these young people, as far as I can tell. Um, but that really speaks to the researchers' values and preferences, where instead of
Yeah.
saying, you know, this is ill-advised, they just say, like, essentially, you should give
To
them
be
an extra
continued.
layer of informed consent, where we're
Yes.
informing you of something you should do if you want to, uh, as
Yeah.
opposed to, say, even requiring it. We don't think it's ethical. Our first general harm principles we violated if we let you
Hmm.
do this absent you taking this recourse. Because how do we know that in 1 to 30 years you're not going to change your mind about wanting kids? And there was this
Hmm.
very famous quote in the WPATH files, they're called, and Michael Schellenberger put out, I think, March of last year, where he had gotten all these leaked documents of these like message boards from WPATH, and one of them was a transcript of a video where it's like these training videos that they would do at WPATH. And this guy, Dan Karasik, who's an endocrinologist in BC, in Vancouver, BC, and he very sort of sassily says that he was quoting this kid who had come back as a young adult and upset about losing their fertility. Oh, so the dog isn't doing it for you? And saying things like trying to explain fertility to these young children is like talking to a brick wall.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that, at what age can you certifiably decide that you're okay with not having children, uh, and sterilizing yourself absent the necessity of doing it? Men get vasectomies, women get their tubes tied, and
Hmm.
their ages at which this is considered medically appropriate. Um,
Hmm.
but can children do that?
Hmm. Yeah, it's really important that people like you are asking questions about this, despite those questions not wanting to be asked by other people.
Yeah, I
That's-
mean, essentially, this entire medical field has really built up this structure by which anyone who does ask what are substantive questions about the field are shunned. There's
Mhm.
this website called, is it what, Transgender Trend.
Yeah, I'm on
This,
there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I'm sure you are. Andrea James, anyone who does anything on a line gets a page on there. And
Hmm.
I don't know what she did, but it always comes up like in your knowledge panel, it's called, if you Google on the phone, there are the three little boxes that are like the main things about you if you're any kind of public figure.
Yeah.
And somehow that gets in there, this dinky little
Yeah.
website. And so
Yeah.
it's very high in the search function. There are theories which I don't feel like I can repeat about who was responsible for, jiggering the Google search function. But yeah, so that's one of the most notice noticeable ways that they get you, essentially. And it
Hmm.
serves as a warning to anyone else.
Mark you. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've talked to people for whom it's been really damaging to their careers. I don't want to say who or what capacity, or it's
Yeah.
damaging to like the parents of their kids' friends, will look
Yeah.
them up, like things like that.
Yeah.
So it's caused a lot of pain, really unjustifiably. And there are lies in there. It just like, it says there was a point 2 years ago where she upped the ante. It used to be where like journalists were described, as just being anti-trans, an anti-trans journalist, whereas she changed it to anti-trans activist for everybody
Oh,
about two
yeah.
years ago,
Yeah.
and that's just, by any definition, like, no, like there are journalists who are activists. Like, where do you see that in my work? I'm sorry, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. 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 I don't know anybody who's been on there who's been able to get themselves off of there. It's
Oh
just very
no.
entrenched.
Yeah, have you ever heard of that? I don't know. I mean, like, it would be very difficult to sue. I don't know.
Yeah.
Expensive. So
Yeah. Ben Ryan, thank you very much for
thanks for
joining
talking.
me for another great episode.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to send me another headshot so we
Okay.
can do a little
Yeah,
bit
the
different
cat
than
came
last time.
in. Just
Yeah, the
is he
cat
a
did come. It's a
yeah,
beautiful little
yeah.
Siamese, is that?
Yeah, he's a blue point. Yeah.
Wow.
Calvin.
Big attitude.
Yeah, he's really like he'll tell you and he's annoyed,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he wants, I want you to play with me now. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's very sleepy in the afternoons, but he gets
That's very
demanding in the
nice.
evenings. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I'll link to
All
all
right.
your work below.
All right. Thanks a
And
lot.
yeah, thank you very
All
much.
right.
Have a good night.
Thanks. All right. Bye.
Bye.